Chapter 14. Requiescat. A strange and mysterious thing is the working of terror on the human mind. Some it renders incapable of thought or action, paralyzing their limbs and stagnating the blood in their veins. Such creatures die in anticipating death. Others, under the stress of that grim passion, have their wits preternaturally sharpened. The instinct of self-preservation assumes command of all their senses and urges them to swift and feverish action. I thank God with a full heart that to this latter class do I belong. After one gelid moment, spent with eyes and mouth agape, my hands fallen limp beside me, and my hair bristling with affright, I became myself again, and never calmer than in that dread moment. I went to work with superhuman swiftness. My cheeks may have been livid, my very lips bloodless, but my hands were steady, and my wits under full control. Concealment for myself and her, was the thing that now imported. And no sooner was a thought conceived than the means were devised. Slender means were they, yet heaven knows I was in no case to be exacting. And since they were the best the place afforded, I must trust to them without demurring, and pray God that Messer Ramiro might lack the wit to search. And with that fresh hope it came to me that I must find a way so to dispose as to make him believe that the search would be a futile waste of energy. The odds against me lay in the little time at my disposal. Yet a little time there was. The door was stout, and Messer Ramiro might take no violent means of bursting it, lest the noise should arouse the street, and I well could guess how little he would relish having lights to shine upon this deed of night of his. With what tools his spur was at work I could not say, but surely they must be such as would leave me a few moments. Already the fellow had begun. I could make out a soft crunching sound, as of steel biting into wood. To act, then, with movement swift as a cat's, and as silent, I went to work. Like a ghost, I glided round the coffin to the other side, where the lid was lying. I took it up, and when for a moment I had deposited Madonna Powell on the ground, I mounted the bench and gently but quickly set back that lid as it had been. Next, I gathered up the cumbrous pall, and mounting the bench once more I spread it across the coffin, this way and that I pulled it, straightening it into the shape that it had worn when first I had entered, and casting its folds into regular lines that would lend it the appearance of having remained undisturbed. And what time I toiled, the half of my mind intent upon my task, the other half was as intent upon the progress of the worker at the door. At last it was done. I set the bench where first it had been at the foot of the catafalque, and gathering up Madonna in my arms, as though her weight had been an infant's, I bore her swiftly out of the circle of light of those four tapers into black, impenetrable gloom beyond. On I sped toward the high altar, flying now as men fly in evil dreams, with the sensation of an enemy upon them, and their progress a mere standing still. Thus I gained the chancel, hurtling against a railing as I passed, and pausing for an instant, wondering whether those without could have heard the noise which in my clumsiness I had made. But the grinding sound continued uninterrupted, and I breathed more freely. I mounted the altar steps, the distant light behind me still feebly guiding me. I ran round to the right, and heaved a great sigh of relief to find my hopes verified, and that the altar of San Domenico was as the altar of other churches I had known. It stood a pace or so from the wall, and behind it there was just such narrow hiding room as I had looked to find. I paused at the mouth of that black opening, and even as I paused, something hard that gave out a metallic sound fell at the far end of the church. Instinct told me it was the lock which those miscreants had cut from the door. I waited for no more, but like a beast scudded to cover, I plunged into that black space. Madonna, wrapped in my cloak as she was, I sat down upon the ground, and then I crept forward on hands and knees and thrust out my head, trusting to the darkness to envelop me. I waited thus for some seconds, my heart beating now against my ribs, as if it would hurl itself out of my bosom, my head and face on fire with the fever reaction that succeeded my late cold pallor. From where I watched, it was impossible to see the door hidden in the black gloom. Away in the center of the church, an island of light in that vast sea of blackness, stood the catafalque with its 4 wax torches. Something creaked, and almost immediately I saw the flames of those tapers bend towards me, beaten over by the gust that smote them from the door. Thus I surmised that Ramiro and his men had entered. The soft fall of their feet, for they were treading lightly now, succeeded, and at last they came into view, shadowy at first, then sharply outlined as they approached the light. A moment they stood in half-whispered conversation, their voices a mere boom of sound in which no word was to be distinguished. Then I saw Ramiro suddenly step forward. I knew him by his great height, and drag away, even as I had done, the pall that hid the coffin. Next he seized a bench and gave a brisk order to his men in a less cautious voice, so that I caught his words. "Spread a cloak," said he, and, in obedience, the four that were with him took a cloak among them, each holding one of its corners. It was thus that he meant to bear her with him. He mounted now the bench, and I could imagine with what elation of mind he put out his hands to remove the coffin lid, as well as if his soul had been transformed into a book conceived for my amusement. Did I surmise the exultant mood that then possessed him? He had tricked Filippo. He had outwitted us all, Madonna herself included, and he was leaving no trace behind him that should warrant any so much as to dare to think that this vile deed was the work of Messer Ramiro del Orca, governor of Cessna. But fate, that arch-humorist, that jester of the gods, delights in mighty contrasts, and has a trick of exalting us by false hopes and hollow lures on the very eve of working our discomfiture. From the soul that but a moment back had been aglow with evil satisfaction, there burst a sudden blasphemous cry of rage that disregarded utterly the sanctity of that consecrated place. By the death of Christ, the coffin is empty. It was a roar of a beast in rage. It was succeeded by a heavy crash as he let fall the coffin lid. A second later, a still louder sound awoke the night echoes of that silent place. In a burst of maniacal frenzy, he had caught the coffin itself a buffet of his mighty fist and hurled it from its trestles. Then he leapt down from the bench and flung all caution to the winds in the excitement that possessed him. "It is a trick of that smooth-faced knave Filippo," he cried. "They have laid a trap for us, animals, and you never informed yourselves." I could imagine the foam about the corners of his mouth, the swelling veins in his brow, and the mad bulging of his hideous eyes, for terror spoke in his words, and the governor of Cesena, overbearing bully though he was, could on occasion, too, become a coward. "Out of this," he growled at them. "See that your swords hang ready. Away!" One of them murmured something that I could not catch. Mother in heaven, if it should be a suggestion of what actually had taken place, a suggestion that the church should be searched ere they abandoned it? But Ramiro's answer speedily relieved my fears. "I'll take no risks," he barked. "Come, let us go separately. I first, and you follow me and get clear of Pesaro as best you can." His voice grew lower, and from what else he said I but caught the words, "Cesena and tomorrow night," from which I gathered that he was appointing that as their next meeting place. Ramiro went, and scarce had the echoes of his footsteps died away ere the others followed in a rush, fearful of being caught in some trap that was here laid for them, and but restrained from flying on the instant by their still greater fear of that harsh master, Ramiro. Thanking heaven for this miraculous deliverance, and for the wit it had lent me so to prepare a scene that should thoroughly mislead those ravishers, I turned me now to Madonna Paula. Her breathing was grown more heavy and more regular, so that in all respects she was as one sleeping healthily. Soon I hoped that she might awaken, for to seek to bear her thence into the palace in my arms would have been a madness. And now it occurred to me that I should have restoratives at hand against the time of her regaining consciousness. Inspiration suggested to me the wine that should be stored in the sacristy for altar purposes. It was unconsecrated, and there could be no sacrilege in using it. I crept round in front of the altar. At the angle a candle branch protruded, standing no higher than my head. It held some 3 or 4 tapers, and was so placed to enable the priest to read his missal at early mass on dark winter mornings. I plucked one of the candles from its socket, and hastening down the church, I lighted it from one of the burning tapers of the bier. Screening it with my hand, I retraced my steps and regained the chancel. Then turning to the left, I made for a door that I knew should give access to the sacristy. It yielded to my touch, and I passed down a short stone-flagged passage and entered the spacious chamber beyond. An oak settle was placed against one wall, and above it hung an enormous, rudely carved crucifix. Facing it against the other wall loomed a huge piece of furniture, half cupboard, half buffet. On a bench in a corner stood a basin and ewer of metal, whilst a few vestments hanging beside these completed the furniture of this austere and whitewashed chamber. Setting my candle on the buffet, I opened one of the drawers. It was full of garments of different kinds, among which I noticed several monks' habits. I rummaged at the bottom, only to find some odd pairs of sandals. Disappointed, I closed the drawer and tried another, with no better fortune. Here were undervestments of fine linen, newly washed and fragrant with rosemary. I abandoned the drawer and gave my attention to the cupboard above. It was locked, but the key was there. It opened, and my candle reflected a blaze on gold and silver vessels, consecrated chalices, a dazzling monstra, and several richly carved cibori of solid gold, set with precious stones. But in the corner I espied a dark brown, gourd-shaped object. It was a skin of wine, and with a half-suppressed cry of joy, I seized it. In that instant, a piercing scream rang through the stillness of the church, and startled me so that I stood there for some seconds, frozen in horror, 100 wild conjectures leaping to my mind. Had Ramiro remained hidden, and was he returned? Did the scream mean that Madonna Paula had been awakened by his rough hands? A second time it came, and now it seemed to break the hideous spell that its first utterance had cast over me. Dropping the leather bottle, I sped back, down the stone passage to the door that abutted on the chancel. There, by the high altar, I saw a form that seemed at first luminous and ghostly, but in which presently I recognized Madonna Paula. The dim rays of the distant tapers finding out the white robe with which her limbs were hung. She was alone, and I knew then that it was but the very natural fear consequent upon awakening in such a place that had provoked the cry I had heard. "Madonna," I called, advancing swiftly toward her. "Madonna Paula." There was a gasp, a moment's stillness, then, "Lazaro," she cried, questioningly. "What has happened? Why am I here?" I was beside her now, and found her trembling like an aspen. "Something horrible has happened, Madonna," I answered. "But it is over now, and the evil is averted. But how came I here? That you shall learn." I stooped to gather up the cloak, which had slipped from her shoulders as she advanced. "Do you wrap this about you?" I urged her, and with my own hands I assisted to enfold her in that mantle. "Are you faint, Madonna?" I asked. "I scarce know," she answered in a frightened voice. "There is a black horror upon me." "Tell me," she implored again, "what does it mean?" I drew her away now, promising to satisfy her in the fullest manner once she were out of these forbidding surroundings. I led her to the sacristy, and seating her upon the settle, I produced that wineskin once again. At first she babbled like a child at not being thirsty, but I was insistent. "It is no matter of quenching thirst, Madonna," I told her. "The wine will warm and revive you. Come, Madonna mia, drink." She obeyed me now, and having got the first gulp down her throat, she drank a lusty draught that was not long in bringing a healthier color to replace the ashen pallor of her cheeks. "I am so cold, Lazaro," she complained. I turned to the drawer in which I had espied the rough monk's habits, and pulling one out, I held it for her to don. She sat there now, in that garment of coarse black cloth, the cowl flung back upon her shoulder, the fairest postulate that ever entered upon a novitiate. "You are good to me, Lazaro," she murmured plaintively, "and I have used you very ill." She paused a second, passing her hand across her brow. Then, "What is the hour?" she asked. It was a question that I left unheeded. I bade her brace herself and have courage for the tale I was to tell. I assured her that the horror of it was all past, and that she had naught to fear. So soon as her natural curiosity should be satisfied, it should be hers to return to her brother at the palace. "But how came I thence?" she cried. I must have lain in a swoon, for I remember nothing. And then her swift mind, leaping to a reasonable conclusion, and assisted, perhaps, by the memory of the shattered catafalque which she had seen. "Did they account me dead, Lazaro?" she asked of a sudden, her eyes dilating with a curious affright as they were turned upon my own. "Yes, Madonna," answered I, "you were accounted dead." And with that, I told her the entire story of what had befallen, saving only that I left my own part unmentioned, nor sought to explain my opportune presence in the church. When I spoke of the coming of Ramiro and his knaves, she shuddered and closed her eyes in very awe. At length, when I had done, she opened them again, and again she turned them full upon me. Their brightness seemed to increase a moment, and then I saw that she was quietly weeping. "And you were there to save me, Lazaro?" she murmured brokenly. "Lazaro mio, it seems that you are ever at hand when I have need of you. You are indeed my one true friend, the one true friend that never fails me. Are you feeling stronger, Madonna?" I asked abruptly, roughly, almost. "Yes, I am stronger." She stood up as if to test her strength. Indeed, little ails me saving the horror of this thing. The thought of it seems to turn me sick and dizzy. Sit then and rest, said I. Presently, when you are more recovered, we will set out. Whither shall we go? She asked. Why? To the palace, to your brother. Why, yes, she answered, as though it were the last suggestion that she had been expecting. And tomorrow. It will be tomorrow, will it not? Comes the Lord Ignacio to claim his bride. He will owe you no mean thanks. Lazaro. There was a pause. I paced the chamber. 100 thoughts crowded my mind, but overriding them all the conjecture how far it might be from Madden's, and how soon we might be discovered by the monks. Presently she spoke again. Lazaro, she inquired very gently, what was it brought you to the church? I came with the others, Madonna, to the burial service, answered I, and fearing such questions as might follow, questions that I had been dreading ever since I had brought her to the sacristy. If you are recovered, we had best be going, I told her gruffly. Nay, I am not yet enough recovered, answered she. And before we go, there are some points in this strange adventure that I would have you make clear to me. Meanwhile, we are very well here. If the good fathers come upon us, what shall it signify? I groaned inwardly, and I grew, I think, more afraid than when Ramiro and his men had broken into the church an hour ago. What kept you here after all were gone? I remained to pray, Madonna, I answered brusquely. Is aught else to be done in a church? To pray for me, Lazaro? She asked. Assuredly, Madonna. Faithful heart, she murmured. And I had used you so cruelly for the deception you practiced. But you merited my cruelty, did you not, Lazaro? Say that you did, else must I perish of remorse. Perhaps I deserved it, Madonna, but perhaps not so much as you bestowed, had you but understood my motives, I said unguardedly. If I had understood your motives, she mused. There is much I do not understand. Even in this night's transactions, there are not wanting things that remain mysterious despite the explanations you have supplied me. Tell me, Lazaro, what was it led you to suppose I still lived? I did not suppose it. I blundered like a fool, never seeing whither her question led. You did not, she cried, in deep surprise, and now, when it was too late, I understood. What was it, then, induced you to lift the coffin lid? You ask me more than I can tell you, I answered, almost roughly. Do you thank God, Madonna, that it was so, and never plague your mind to learn the why of it? She looked at me with eyes that were singularly luminous. But I must know, she insisted. Have I not the right? Tell me now. Was it that you wished to see my face again before they gave me over to the grave? Perhaps it was that, Madonna, I answered in confusion, avoiding her glance. Then, shall we be going? I suggested fiercely. But she never heeded that suggestion. She spoke as if she had not heard, and the words she uttered seemed to turn me into stone. Did you love me then so much, dear Lazaro? I swung round to face her now, and I know that my face was white, whiter than hers had been when I beheld her in her coffin. My eyes seemed to burn in their sockets as they met hers. A madness overtook me and whelmed my better judgment. I had undergone so much that day through grief, and that night through 100 emotions, that I was no longer fully master of myself. Her words robbed me, I think, of my last lingering shred of reason. Love you, Madonna? I echoed, in a voice that was as unlike my own as was the mood that then possessed me. You are the air I breathe, the sun that lights my miserable world. You are dearer to me than honor, sweeter than life. You are the guardian angel of my existence, the saint to whom I have turned morning and evening in my prayers for grace. Do I love you, Madonna? And there I paused. The thought of what I did and what the consequences must be rushed suddenly upon me. I shivered as a man shivers in a waking. I dropped on my knees before her, bowing my head and flinging wide my arms. Forgive, Madonna, I cried entreatingly. Forgive and forget. Never again will I offend. Neither forgive nor forget will I, came her voice, charged with ineffable sweetness, and her hands descended on my bowed bead, as if she would bless and soothe me. I am conscious of no offense that craves forgiveness, and what you have said I would not forget if I could. Whence springs this fear of yours, dear Lazaro? Am I more than woman, or you less than man, that you should tremble for confession, that in a wild moment I have dragged from you. For that wild moment, I shall be thankful to my life's end. For your words have been the sweetest ever my poor ears listened to. Once I thought that I loved the Lord Giovanni Sforza, but it was you I loved, for the deeds that earned in my affection were deeds of yours and not of his. Once I told you so in scorn, yet since then I have come soberly to ponder it. I account you, Lazaro, the noblest friend, the bravest gentleman, and the truest lover that the world has known. Need it surprise you, then, that I love you and that mine would be a happy life if I might spend it in growing worthy of this noble love of yours. There was a knot in my throat and tears in my eyes, a matter at which I take no shame. Air seemed to fail me for a moment, and I almost thought that I should swoon. So overcome was I, transport the blackest soul from among the damned to hell, wash it white of its sins, and seat on one of the glorious thrones of heaven, then ponder its emotions, and you may learn something of what I felt. At last, when I had mastered the exquisite torture of my joy. Madonna mia, I cried, bethink you of what you say. You are the noble lady of Sant'Afer, and I. No more of this, she interrupted me. You are Lazaro Biancamont, of patrician birth, no matter to what odd shifts of cruel fortune may have driven you. Will you take me? She had my face between her palms, and she forced my glance to meet her own saintly eyes. Will you take me, Lazaro? She repeated. Holy flower of the quince, was all that I could murmur, whereat she gently smiled. Santo fier di Catonio. And then a great sadness overwhelmed me, a tide that neaped the frail bark of happiness high, and dry upon the shores of black despair. Tomorrow, Madonna, comes the Lord Ignacio Borgia. I groaned. I know, said she, but I have thought of that. Paulus Sforza di Sant'Afer is dead. Requiescat. We must dispose that they will let her rest in peace. Chapter 15. An ill encounter. Speechless, I stared at her a moment. So taken was I with the immensity of the thing that she suggested. Fear, amazement, and joy jostled one another for possession of my mind. Why do you look so, Lazaro? She exclaimed at last. What is it daunts you? How is the thing possible? Quoth I. What difficulty does it present? She questioned back. The governor of Cesena has rendered very possible what I propose. We may look on him tomorrow as our best friend. But Ramiro knows, I reminded her. True, but do you think that he will dare to tell the world what he knows? He might be asked to say how he comes by his knowledge, and that should prove a difficult question to answer. Tell me, Lazaro, she continued, if he had succeeded in carrying me away, what think you would have been said in Pesaro tomorrow when the coffin was found empty? They would assume that your body had been stolen by some wizard or some daring student of anatomy. Ah, and if we were quietly to quit the church and be clear of Pesaro before morning, would not the same be said? Probably, answered I. Then why hesitate? Is it that you do not love me enough, Lazaro? I smiled, and my eyes must have told her more than any protestation could. Then I sighed. I hesitate, Madonna, because I would not have you do now what you might come hereafter bitterly to repent. I would not let you be misled by the impulse of a moment into an act whose consequences must endure as long as life itself. Is that the reasoning of a lover? She asked me, very quietly. Is this cold argument, this weighing of issues, consistent with the stormy passion you profess so lately? It is, I answered stoutly. It is because I love you more than I love myself that I would have you reflect ere you adventure your life upon such a broken raft as mine. You are Paulus Sforza di Sant'Afer, and I... Enough of that, she interrupted me, rising. She swept towards me, and before I knew it her hands were on my shoulders, her face upturned, and her blue eyes on mine, depriving me of all will and all resistance. Lazaro, said she, and there was an intensity almost fierce in her low tones. Moment are flying, and you stand here reasoning with me, and bidding me weigh what is already weighed for all time. Will you wait until escape is rendered impossible, until we are discovered, before you'll decide to save me, and to grasp with both hands this happiness of ours that is not twice offered in a lifetime? She was so close to me that I could almost feel the beating of her heart, some subtle perfume reaching me and combining with the dominion that her eyes seemed to have established over me, completed my subjugation. I was as warm wax in her hands. Forgotten were all considerations of rank and station. We were just a man and a woman whose fates were linked irrevocably by love. I stooped suddenly, under the sway of an impulse I could not resist, and kissed her upturned face, turning almost dizzy in the act. Then I broke from her clasp, and bracing myself for the task to which we stood committed by that kiss. "Paula," said I, "we must devise a means to get away. I will bear you to my mother's home near by Ancamont, that you may dwell there at least until we are wed. But the thing that exercises my mind is how to make our unobserved escape from Pesaro." "I have thought of it already," she informed me quietly. "You have thought of it?" I cried, and what have you thought? For answer, she stepped back a pace and drew the cowl of the monk's habit over her head until her features were lost in the shadows of it. She stood before me now, a diminutive Dominican brother. Her meaning was clear to me at once. With a cry of gladness, I turned to the drawer whence I had taken the habit in which she was arrayed, and selecting another one, I hastily donned it above the garments that I wore. No sooner was it done than I caught her by the arm. "Come, Madonna," I bade her in an urgent voice. At the first step she stumbled. The habit was so long that it cumbered her feet, but that was a difficulty soon conquered. With my dagger, I cut a piece in the skirt of it, enough to leave her freedom of movement, and, that accomplished, we set out. We crossed the church swiftly and silently. In a moment I left in the porch whilst I surveyed the street. All was quiet. Pesaro still slept, and it must have wanted some 2 hours or more to the dawn. A fine rain was falling as we sallied out, and there was a sting in the December wind, which made us draw our cowls the tighter about our face. Abandoning the main street, I led her down some narrow alleys, deserted like all the rest of the city, and not so much as a stray cat abroad in that foul weather. It was very dark, and 100 times we stumbled, whilst in some places I almost carried her bodily to avoid the filth of the quarter we were traversing. At length we gained the space in front of the gates that open onto the northern road, known as Porta Venezia, and I would have blundered on and roused the guard to let us out, using the Borgia ring once more, that talisman whose power had grown during these years, so that it would now open me almost any door in Italy. But Paula stayed me. Wisely she counseled that we should do nothing that might draw too much attention upon ourselves, and she urged me to wait until the dawn, when the guard would be astir and the gates opened. So we fled to the shelter of a porch, and there we waited, huddling ourselves out of reach of the icy rain. We talked little during the time we spent there. For my own part, one had overmuch food for thought, and a very natural anxiety racked me. Soon the monks would be descending to the church, and they would discover the havoc there, and spread the alarm. Who could say but that they might even discover the abstraction of the 2 habits from the sacristy, and the hue and cry for 2 men in the sackcloth of Dominicans would be afoot, for they would infer that 2 men so disguised had made off with the body of Madonna Paula. The thought stirred me like a goad. I stood up. The night was growing thinner, and suddenly, even as I rose, a light gleamed from one of the windows of the guardhouse. God be thanked for that fellow's early rising. I cried out, "Come, Madonna, let us be moving," and I added my newly conceived reasons for quitting the place without further delay, cursing us for being so early abroad, a curse to which I responded with a sonorous "Pax Domini sit tecum." The still somnolent sentinel opened the post and let us pass. I was glad in the end that we had waited, and thus avoided the necessity of showing my ring, for should inquiries be made concerning 2 monks, that ring of mine might have betrayed the identity of one of them. I gave thanks to heaven that I knew the country well. A quarter of a league or so from Pesaro, we quitted the high road and took to the bypaths with which I was well acquainted. Day came, gray and forbidding at first, but presently the rain ceased and the sun flashed out 1,000 diamonds from the drenched hedgerows. We plodded on, and at length, towards noon, when we had gained the neighborhood of the village of Cattolica, we halted at the hut of a peasant on a small campagna. I had divested myself of my monk's habit, and cut away the cowl from Madonna's. She had thereafter fashioned it by means that were mysterious to my dull man's mind into a more feminine-looking garb. Thus we now presented ourselves to the old man who was the sole tenant of that lonely and squalid house. A ducat opened his doors wide as it would go, and gave us free access to every cranny of his dwelling. Food he procured us, rough black bread, some pieces of roasted goat, and some goat's milk, and on this we regaled ourselves as though it had been a ducal banquet, for hunger had set us in a mood to account anything delicious. And when we had eaten, we fell to talking, the old man having left us to go about such peasant duties as claimed his attention, and our talk concerned ourselves, our future first, and later on our past. I remember that Madonna returned to the matter of the deception that I had practiced, seeking to learn what reasons had impelled me, and I answered her in all truth. Madonna mia, I think it must have been to win your love. When Giovanni Sforza bade me, with many a threat, to write those verses, I undertook the task with ready gladness, for in his performance I was to pour out the tale of the passion that was consuming my poor heart. It occurred to me that if those verses were worthy, you might come to love their author for their beauty, and so I strove to render them beautiful. It was the same spirit urged me to don the Lord Giovanni's armor and fight in that splendid if futile skirmish. Even as you had come to love the author for his verses, so might you come to love the warrior for his valor. That you should account the one and the other the work of Giovanni Sforza was to me a little thing, since I was well content to think that you but loved him because you accounted as the things that I had performed. Therefore was I the one you truly loved, although you did not know it. Could you but conceive what consolation that reflection was to me, you would deal lightly with me for my deceit. I can conceive it, she answered very gently, her eyes downcast. And now that I know the motives that impelled you, I almost love you for that deceit itself, for it seems to me that it holds some quality well worthy of devotion. Such was our talk, all in nature to help us to a better understanding of each other, and all seeming to endear us more and more by showing us how close the past had already drawn us. Later I rose and announced my intention of adventuring into Cattolica, there procure her garments more seemly than those she wore, in which she might journey on and come into the presence of my mother. Also, there was in Cattolica a man I knew, of whom I hoped for the loan of enough money to enable me to purchase mules, to the end that we might journey in more dignity and comfort. It was then about the 20th hour, and I hoped to return by nightfall. I took my leave of Madonna, enjoining her to rest and to seek sleep whilst I was absent, and with that I set out. Cattolica was no more than a half-league distant, and I looked to reach it in a half-hour or so. I fell into thought as I trudged along, and I was building plans for the sunlit future that was to be ours. I was a man transformed that day, and I could have sung in spite of the chill December wind that buffeted me. So full of joy and gladness was my heart. At Boccadoro, I was likely to spend my days as little better than a peasant. But surely a peasant's estate with such a companion as was to be mine was preferable to an emperor's throne without her. The bleak landscape seemed to me invested with a beauty that at no other time I should have noticed. God was good. I swore 1,000 times. The world was a good world. So good that heaven could scarce be better. I had come, perhaps, the better half of the distance I had to travel, and I was giving full rein to my joyous fancy, when suddenly I espied ahead a company of horsemen. They were approaching me at a brisk pace, but I took no thought of them, accounting myself secure from any molestation. If it so happened, it was a search party from Pesaro, seeking 2 men disguised as monks who had ravished the coffin of Madonna Paula di Santafiore. What should they want of Lazzaro Biancamont? And so, in my confidence, I advanced even as they trotted quickly towards me. Not until they were within a matter of 100 paces did I raise my eyes to take their measure, and then I halted on my step, smitten of a sudden by an unreasoning and unreasonable fear, to see at their head the bulky form of the governor of Cesena. He saw me, too, and what was worse, he recognized me on the instant, for he clapped spurs to his horse and came at me as if he would ride me down. Within 3 paces of me, he drew up his steed. Whether the memory of the other 2 occasions on which I had thwarted him arose now in his mind, and made him wonder had not some fatality brought me across his path again to send awry his pretty schemes concerning Madonna Paula, I cannot say for certain. Yet some suspicion of it occurred to me and filled me with apprehension. "Body of Bacchus," he roared, "is it truly you, Boccadoro? They call me Biancamont now, magnificent." I answered him, but my tone was respectful, for it could profit me nothing to incense him. "A fig for what they call you," he snapped contemptuously. "Whence are you?" "From Pesaro," I answered truthfully. "From Pesaro? But you are traveling towards it." "True. I was making for Cattolica, but I missed my way in seeking to shorten it. I am now returning by the high road." The explanation satisfied him on that point, and being satisfied, he asked me when I had left Pesaro. A moment I hesitated. "Late last night," said I at last. He looked at me, my foolish hesitation having perhaps unslipped a suspicion that was straining at his leash. "In that case," said he, "you can scarcely have heard the strange story that is being told there?" I looked at him, as if puzzled, for a second. "If you mean the story of Madonna Paulia's end, I heard it yesterday." "Why? What story was that?" quoth he in some surprise, his beetling brows coming together in one broad line of fur. I shrugged my shoulders. "Men said that she had been poisoned." "Oh, that!" he cried indifferently. "But men say today that her body was stolen from the church of San Domenico, where it lay. An odd happening, is it not?" And his eyes covered me in a fierce scrutiny that again suggested to me those suspicions of his that I might be the man who had anticipated him. I was soon to learn that he had more grounds than at first I thought for those same suspicions. Odd indeed. I answered calmly, for all that I felt my pulses quickening with apprehension. "But is it true?" I added. He shrugged his shoulders. "Rumor's habit is to lie," he answered. "Yet for such a lie as that, so monstrous an imagination would be needed that, rather, am I inclined to account it truth. There are no more poets in Pesaro since you left. But at what hour was it that you quitted the city? To hesitate again were to betray myself. It were to suggest that I was seeking an answer that should sort well with the rest of my story. Besides, what could the hours signify? It would be about the first hour of night," I said. He looked at me with increasing strangeness. "You must indeed have wandered from your road to have got no farther than this in all that time. Perhaps you were hampered by some heavy burden?" He leered evilly, and I turned cold. I was burdened with nothing heavier than this body of mine, and a rather uneasy conscience. "Where, then, have you tarried?" At this I thought it time to rebel. Were I too meekly to submit to this examination, my very meekness might afford him fresh grounds for doubts. "Once have I told you," I answered wearily, "that I lost my way, and, however much it may flatter me to have your Excellency evincing such an interest in my concerns, I am at a loss to find a reason for it." He leered prodigiously once more, and his eyebrows shot up to the level of his cap. "I will tell you, brute beast," he answered me. "I question you because I suspect that you are hiding something from me. What should I hide from your Excellency?" He dared not enlighten me on that point, for should his suspicions prove unfounded, he would have uselessly betrayed himself. "If you are honest, why do you lie?" I ejaculated. "In what have I lied?" "In that you have told me that you left Pesaro at the first hour of night. At the third hour you were still in the church of San Domenico, whither you followed Madonna Paula's bier." It was my turn to knit my brows. "Was I indeed?" quoth I. "Why, yes, it may well be. But what of that? Is the hour in which I quitted Pesaro a matter of such moment as to be worth lying over? If I said that I left about the first hour, it is because I was under the impression that it was so. But I was so distraught by grief at Madonna's death that I may have been careless in my account of time." "More lies," he blazed with sudden passion. "It may have been the third hour, you say. Fool, the gates of Pesaro close at the second hour of night. Where are your wits?" Outwardly calm, but inwardly in a panic, more for Madonna's sake than for my own, I promptly held out the hand on which I wore the Borgia ring. In a flash of inspiration, did that counter suggest itself to me. There is a key that will open any gate in Romagna at any hour. He looked at the ring, and of what passed in his mind I can but offer a surmise. He may have remembered that once before I had fooled him with the help of that gold circlet, or he may have thought that I was secretly in the service of the Borgias, and that, acting in their interests, I had carried off Madonna Paula. Be that as it may, the sight of the ring threw him into a fury. He turned on his horse. "Lucagnolo!" he called, and a man of officer's rank detached himself from a score of men-at-arms and rode forward. "Let 6 men escort me home to Cesena. Take you the remainder and beat up the country for 3 leagues about this spot. Do not leave a house outside Cattolica unsearched. You know what we are seeking." The man inclined his head. "If it is within the circle you have appointed, we will find it," he answered confidently. "Set about it," was the surly command, and Ramiro turned again to me. "You have gone a little pale, good Messer Boccadoro," he sneered. "We shall soon learn whether you have sought to fool me. Woe betide you, should it be so. We bear a name for swift justice at Cesena. So be it then, I answered as calmly as I might. Meanwhile, perhaps you will now suffer me to go my ways. The readier, since your way must lie with ours. Not so. Magnificent, I am for Catholica. Not so, animal. He mimicked me with elephantine grace. You are for Cecina, and you had best go with goodwill. Our manner constraining men is reputed rude. He turned again. Ercole, take you this man behind you. Assist him, Stefano. And so it was done, and a few minutes later I was riding, strapped to the steel-clad Ercole, away from Paola at every stride. Thus at every stride the anguish that possessed me increased, as the fear that they must find her rose ever higher. Chapter 16. In the citadel of Cecina. I will not harass you at any further length with the feelings that were mine as we sped northward toward Cecina. If you are a person of some imagination and not destitute of human sympathy, you will be able to surmise them. If you are not, why then, my tale is not for you, and it is more than probable that you will have wearied of it and flung it aside long before you reach this page. We rode so hard that by sunset Cecina was in sight, and ere night had fallen we were within the walls of the citadel. It was when we had dismounted, and I stood in the courtyard between Ercole and another of the soldiers, that Ramiro again addressed me. Animal, said he, they tell me that I bear a name for harsh measures and rough ways. You shall be a witness hereafter of how deeply I am maligned. For instead of putting you to the question and loosening your lying tongue with a rack, I am content to keep you a prisoner until my men return with that which I suspect you to be hiding from me. But if I then discover that you have sought to fool me, you shall flutter from Ramiro del Orca's flagstaff. He pointed up to the tower of the castle, from which a beam protruded, laden at that moment with a ghastly burden just discernible in the thickening gloom. He named it well when he called it his flagstaff, and the miserable banner of carrion that hung from it was a fitting pennon for the ruthless governor of Cecina. Worthy was he to have worn the silver hauberk of Werner von Urslingen with its motto, the enemy of God, of pity, and of mercy. Forbidding, black-browed men caught me with rough hands and dragged me off to a dank, unlighted prison, as empty of furniture as it was full of noisome smells. And there they left me to my ugly thoughts and my deeply despondent mood, what time the governor of Cecina supped with his officers in the hall of the castle. Ramiro drank deep that night, as was his habit, and being overladen with wine it entered his mind that in one of his dungeons lay Lazzaro Biancamont, who at one time had been known as Boccadoro, the merriest fool in Italy. In his drunkenness he grew merry, and when Ramiro del Orca grew merry, men crossed themselves and betook them to their prayers. He would fain be amused, and to serve that end he summoned one of his sbirri and bade the fellow drag Boccadoro from his dungeon and fetch him into his presence. When they came for me I turned cold with fear that Madonna was already taken, and by contrast with such a fear as that, the reflection that he might carry out his threat to hang me from that black beam of his faded into insignificant proportions. They ushered me into a great hall, not ill-furnished, the floor strewed plentifully with rushes, and warmed by an enormous fire of blazing oak. By the door stood two pikemen in armor, like a pair of statues. In the center of the floor was a heavy oaken board, laden now with flagons and beakers, at which sat Ramiro with a pair of gossips so villainous to look at that the sight of them reminded me of the adage, God makes a man and then accompanies him. The governor made a hideous noise at sight of me, which I was constrained to accept as expression of horrid glee. Boccadoro, said he, do you recall that when last I had the honor of being entertained by your pert tongue, I promised you that did you ever cross my path again, I would raise you to the dignity of fool of my court of Cecina? Into what magniloquence does vanity betray us? His court of Cecina, as well might you describe a pigsty, as a bower of roses. But his words, despite the unsavory thing of which they seemed to hold a promise, fell sweetly on my ear, inasmuch as for the time they relieved my fears touching Madonna. It was not to advise me of her capture that he had me haled into his odious presence. I gathered courage. Have you not fools enough already at Cecina? I asked him. A moment he looked as if he were inclining to anger. Then he burst into a coarse laugh and turned to one of his gossips. Did I not tell you, Lampignani, that his wit was quick and penetrating? Hear him, rogue. Already has he discerned your quality. He laughed consumedly at his own jest, and turning to me he pointed to a crimson bundle on a chair beside me. Take those garments, he roughly bade me. Go dress yourself in them. Then come you back and entertain us. Without answering him, and already anticipating the nature of the clothes he bade me don, I lifted one of the garments from the heap. It was a foliated jester's cap, with a bell hanging from every point, which gave out a tinkling sound as I picked it up. I let it fall again as though it had scorched me. The memory of what stood between Madonna Paula and me rising like a warning specter in my mind. I would not again defile myself by the garb of folly. Not again would I incur the shame of playing the fool for the amusement of others. May it please your excellency to excuse me, I answered in a firm tone. I have made a vow never again to put on motley. He eyed me sardonically for a moment, as if enjoying in anticipation the pleasure compelling me against my will. He sat back in his chair and threw one heavily booted leg across the other. In the citadel of Cecina, said he, we fear neither God nor devil, and vows are as water to us, things we cannot stomach. It does not please me to excuse you. I may have paled a little before the sinister smile with which he accompanied his words, but I stood my ground boldly. It is not, said I, a question of what a vow may be to you and yours, but of what vow is to me. It is a thing I cannot break. Sang di Cristo, he snarled. We will break it for you, then that or your bones. Resolve yourself, beast, the motley of the rack. Or yet, if you prefer it, there's the cord yonder. And he pointed to far end of the chamber, where some ropes were hanging from a pulley, the implements of the ghastly torture of the cord. Of such a nature was this monster that he made a torture chamber of his dining hall. Let the rogue make acquaintance with it, laughed Lampignani, showing a mouthful of yellow teeth behind the black beard that bushed his lips. I'll swear his dancing would afford us more amusement than his quips. Swing him up illustrious. But the illustrious seemed to ponder the matter. You shall have 5 minutes in which to decide, he informed me presently. They say that I am cruel. Behold how patient is my clemency. 5 minutes shall you have where many another would hang you out a hand for bearding him as you have done me. You may begin at once, said I. Neither 5 minutes nor 5 years will alter my determination. His brow grew black with anger. We shall see, was all he said. There was a silence now in which we waited, a storm of thoughts battling in my mind. Presently Ramiro caught up one of the flagons and applied it to his cup. It proved empty, and in a gust of passion he hurled it against the wall, where it burst into 1,000 pieces. Clearly he was very angry, and it taxed my wits to account for the little measure of patience he was showing me. Beppo, he called. A page lounging by the buffet sprang to attention. He was a slender, rather delicate lad, fair of hair and blue of eyes, not more than 12 years of age. An elderly man who stood beside him, one Mariani, the seneschal of Cecina, stepped forward, also solicitude in his glance. Bring me wine, bawled the ogre. Must I tell you what I need? If you do not put those eyes of yours to better service, I'll have them plucked from your empty head. Bestir, animal. The old man caught up a beaker from buffet and handed it to the boy. Here, my son, said he, hasten to his excellency. The lad took the beaker from his father's hands, and trembling in his fear of Ramiro's anger, he sprang forward to serve him. In his haste, the poor youth slipped in some grease that clung to the rushes. In seeking to recover himself, he tripped over the feet of one of the halberdiers that guarded me, and measured his length upon the floor at Ramiro's feet, flooding the governor's legs with the wine he carried. How shall I tell you the horror that was the sequel? For just one instant Ramiro looked down at the sprawling lad, his eyes glowing like a madman's. Then suddenly he rose, stooped, and set one hand to the boy's belt, the other to the collar of his jerkin. Feeling himself lifted, and knowing whose were the dread hands that held him, poor Beppo uttered a single scream of terror. Then Ramiro swung him round with an ease that displayed the man's prodigious strength. For just a second, he seemed to hesitate how to dispose of the human bundle that he held. Then, as if suddenly taking his resolve, that devil hurled the lad across the little intervening space, straight into the heart of the blazing fire. Beppo hurtled against the logs with a sickening crash, and 1,000 sparks leapt up and vanished in the cavern of the chimney. Ramiro wheeled sharply about, and snatching the pike from the hands of one of my guards, he pinned down the poor body of the boy to make sure of his victim's entire destruction. Away by the buffet, old Mariani looked on with a face as gray as ashes, his eyes protruding in horror at the thing they witnessed. One glimpse I had him, and I scarce know which was a sight that sickened me more, the father's anguish or the twitching limbs of the burning child. 2 legs and 2 arms protruded from the blaze and writhed and wriggled horribly what time the flames peeled the garments from them and licked the flesh from the bones. At length they fell still and sank down into the white heat of the logs, a hideous, pungent odor spreading through the chamber. From the old man by the buffet, who had stood spellbound during this ghastly scene, there broke at last an anguished cry. "Mercy, my lord, mercy!" The governor of Cecina straightened himself from his task, pulled the pike from the flames, and restored it to the man-at-arms. Then, turning to Mariani, "Fetch me wine," he bade him curtly, as he seated himself once more upon the chair from which he had risen to perform that deed of ghastly ruthlessness. A torch spluttered suddenly in its sconce, and the fierce hissing of the fire, like some monster licking its chops over a bloody meal, were the only sounds that disturbed the stillness that ensued. Every man there, including Ramiro's table companions, was white to the lips, for accustomed though they might be to horrors in that brigand's nest, this was a horror that surpassed anything they had ever witnessed. The silence irked Messer Ramiro. He looked round from under his shaggy brows, and he spluttered out an oath. "Will you bring me this wine, pig?" he growled at the almost senseless Mariani, and in his air and voice there was a promise of such terrific things that the old man put aside his horror to make room for his fears, and mechanically seizing another flagon, he hurried forward to minister to the wants of his fearful lord. Ramiro eyed him with cynical amusement. "Your hand shakes, Mariani," he derided him. "Are you cold? Go warm yourself," he added, with a brutal laugh and a jerk of his thumb toward the fire. "My eyes have looked upon some gruesome sights, and I have heard such tales of ruthless cruelty as you would deem almost passing possibility. I have read of the awful doings of the Lord Bernabo Visconti at Milan in the olden time, but I believe that compared with this monstrous Cecina, that same Bernabo was no worse than a sucking dove. How it befell that men permitted him to live, how it was that none bethought him to put poison in his wine or a knife in his back, is something that I shall never wholly understand. Could it be that these robbers of whom he made a hedge for his protection were no better than himself, or was it that the man's terrific brutality was on such a scale that it filled him with an almost supernatural awe of him? To men better versed than am I in the mysterious ways of human nature, do I leave the answering of these questions. The ogre turned his bloodshot eyes upon me, as with his hand he caressed his tawny beard. He seemed to have cooled a little now, and have regained some mastery of his drunken self. Old Mariani tottered back to his buffet, and stood leaning against it, his eyes wandering, with the look of a man demented, to the fire that had devoured his child. There, indeed, if he escaped the madness with which the poignancy of his grief was threatening him, was a tool that might turn its edge against this inhuman monster, this devil, this bloody carnifex of a governor. "Chance," said Ramiro, "has designed that you should see something of how we deal with clumsy knaves at Cecina, Boccadoro. To disobedient ones I can assure you that we are not half so merciful. There is no such short shrift for them. You have had more than the time I promised you for reflection. The garments await you yonder. Let us know." The door opened suddenly, and a servant entered. "A courier from the Lord Vitellozzo Vitelli, tyrant of Città di Castello," he announced, unwittingly breaking in upon Ramiro's words, "with urgent messages for the high and mighty governor of Cecina." On the instant Ramiro rose, the expression of his face changing from cynical amusement to sober concern, the task upon which he was engaged forgotten. "Admit him instantly," he commanded, and whilst he waited he paced the chamber in long strides, his chin thrust slightly forward, suggestive of deep thought. And during that pause, I, too, was thinking, not indeed of him, nor vainly speculating upon such matters as might be involved in the message, the announcement which seemed so deeply to engage his mind, but chiefly of my own and Madonna Paola's concerns. It was not fear of what I had seen that now sent my thoughts into a new channel, and inspired me with the wisdom of obeying Ramiro del Orca's behest that I should don the hateful motley and play the fool for his diversion. It was not that I feared death. It was that I feared what the consequences of my death might be to Paola di Santafiore. However desperate a position may seem, unlooked-for loopholes often present themselves, and so long as we live and have sound limbs to aid us to see such opportunities as may offer, it is a weak thing utterly to abandon hope. Was it, then, not better to submit to the shame of the motley once again for a little time, when by so doing I might perhaps live to work my own salvation, and Madonna should she suffer capture, rather than stubbornly to invite him to put me to death out of a feeling of false pride? The very resolve seemed to lend me strength and to revive the hope that lay moribund in my breast. And then, scarce was it taken, when the door again opened and a man who was splashed from head to foot with mud, in earnest of how hard he had ridden, was ushered in. He advanced to Monsieur Ramiro, bowed, and presented a package. Ramiro broke the seal, and standing with his back to the fire, immediately in the light shed by one of the wax torches, he read the letter. Then his eyes wandered to the man who had brought it, and to me it seemed that they dwelt particularly upon the hat the courier was holding in his hand. "Take this good fellow to the kitchen," he bade the servant that had introduced him. "Let him be fed and rested." Then, turning to the man himself, "I shall require you to set out at daybreak with my answer," he said. And so, with a wave of the hand, he dismissed him. As the messenger departed, Ramiro returned to the table, filled himself a cup of wine, and drank. "What says the Lord Vitelli?" Lampignani ventured to ask him. "If he knew you," answered Ramiro with a scowl, "he would counsel me to strangle some of the over-inquisitive rascals that surround me." "Over-inquisitive?" echoed Lampignani boldly. "Body of God, it were enough to wake the curiosity of an ecstatic hermit to have a mud-splashed courier from Città di Castello at Cesena 3 times within one little week." Ramiro looked at him, and by his glance it was plain to see that the words had jarred his temper. Whatever it was that Vitelli wrote to Ramiro, this gentleman was not minded to divulge it. "If you have supped, Lampignani," said the governor slowly, his eyes upon his offending officer, "perhaps you will find some duty to perform ere you seek your bed." Lampignani turned crimson, and for a moment seemed to hesitate. Then he rose. He was a man of choleric aspect, and that he served under Ramiro del Orca was as much a danger to the governor as to himself. He had not the air of one whom it was wise to threaten, in however veiled a manner. "Shall I fetch you this fellow's hat ere I sleep?" he inquired, with contemptuous insolence. Not a word did Ramiro answer him, but his glance fastened upon Lampignani, with an expression before which that impudent ruffian lowered his own bold eyes. Thus for a moment. Then, with an awkward laugh to cover the intimidation that he felt, Lampignani walked heavily from the room and banged the door after him. There was about it all a strangeness that set my wits to work in a mighty busy fashion. That work suffered interruption by the harsh voice of Ramiro. "Are you resolved, Boccadoro?" he growled at me. "Have you decided for the motley or the cord?" Instantly I fell into the part one was to play. "Did I choose the latter," said I, with an assumption of sudden airiness and such a grimace as was part and parcel of my old-time trade, "then were I truly worthy of the former, for I should have proved myself, indeed, a fool. Yet if I choose the former, I pray that you'll not follow the same course of reasoning, and hold me worthy of the latter." When he had understood its subtleties, for his wits were of a quality that would have disgraced a calf, he roared to conceit, and seemingly thrown into a better humor by the promise of more such entertainment, he bade my guards release me, and urged me to assume the motley without more delay. What time I was obeying him, my mind was returning to that matter of Lampignani's words, and it is not difficult to understand how I should arrive at the only possible conclusion they suggested. The hats of the other messengers from Vitelli, that the officer had mentioned, had been brought to Ramiro. The reason for this that at once arose in my mind was that within the messenger's hat there was a second and more secret communication for the governor. This secrecy and Ramiro's display of anger at seeing a hint of it betrayed by Lampignani struck me, not unnaturally, as suspicious. What were these hidden communications that passed between Vitellozzo Vitelli and the governor of Cesena? It was a matter which I could not pretend to offer a solution, but nevertheless, it was one, I thought, that promised to repay investigation. Ramiro grew impatient, and my reflections suffered interruption by his rough command that I should hasten. One of the men-at-arms helped me to truss my points, and when that was done, I stepped forward. Boccadoro, the fool once more. Chapter 17. The seneschal. For an hour or so that night, I played the fool for Messer Ramiro's entertainment in a manner which did high justice to the fame that at Pesaro I had earned for the name of Boccadoro, beginning with quip and jest and paradox, aimed now at him, now at the officer who had remained to keep him company in his cups, now at the servants who ministered to him, now the guard standing at attention. I passed on later to play the part of narrator, and I delighted his foul and prurient mind with the story of Andruccio de Perugia and another of the more licentious tales of Messer Giovanni Boccacci. I crimson now with shame at the manner in which I set myself to pander to his mood, that with my wit I might defend my life and limbs, and preserve them for the service of my holy flower the quince in the hour of her need. One man alone of all those present did I spare my banner. This was the old seneschal Miriani. He stood at his post by the buffet, and ever and anon he would come forward to replenish Messer Ramiro's cup in obedience to the monster's imperious orders. What fortitude was it, I wondered, that kept the old man outwardly so calm? His face was as the face of one who is dead, its features set and rigid, its color ashen, but his step was tolerably firm, and his hand seemed to have lost the trembling that had assailed it under the first shock of the horror he had witnessed. As I watched him furtively, I thought that were I Ramiro I should beware of him. That frozen calm argued to me some terrible labor of the mind beneath that livid mask. But the governor of Cesena appeared insensible, or else he was contemptuous of danger from that quarter. It may even have delighted his outrageous nature to behold a man whose son he had done to death with such brutality continue obedient and submissive to his will, for it may have flattered his vanity by the concession that bearing seemed to make to his grim power. An hour went by. My second tale was done, and I was now entrancing Messer Ramiro with some impromptu verses upon the divorce of Giovanni Sforza, a theme set me by himself, when I was interrupted by the arrival of a soldier who entered unannounced. I paled and turned cold at the cry with which Ramiro rose to greet him, and the words he dropped, which told me that here was one of the riders of the party that, under Lucagnolo, had been ordered to search the country about Cattolica. Had they found Madonna? Messer Lucagnolo, the fellow announced, has sent me to report to you the failure of his search to the west and north of Cattolica. He has beaten the country thoroughly for 3 leagues of the town on those 2 sides, as you desired him, but unfortunately without result. He is now spreading his search to the south, and not a house is being left unvisited. By morning he hopes to report again to your excellency. A wild wave of joy swept through my soul. They had ransacked the country west and north of Cattolica without result. Why then, assuredly, they had missed a peasant's hut that sheltered her, and where she waited yet for my return. Their search to the south I knew would prove equally futile. I could have fallen on my knees in a prayer of thanksgiving had my surroundings been other than they were. Ramiro's I wandered round to me and settled on me in a lowering glance. By his face it was plain that the message disappointed him. "I wonder," said he, "whether we can make you talk?" And from me his eyes roamed on to the instrument of torture at the end of that long chamber. I grew sick with fear, for if he were to do this thing and made me by it, how should I avail myself or her hereafter? "Excellency," I cried, "since you met me you have hinted at something that I am hiding from you, at something touching which I could give you information did I choose. What it may be passes all thought of mine. But this I do assure you, no torture can make me tell you what I do not know, nor is any torture needed to extract from me such information as I may be possessed of. I do but beg that you wilt frankly question me upon this matter, whatever it may be, and your excellency shall be answered to the best of my knowledge." He looked at me as if taken aback a little by my assurance and the seemingly transparent candor of my speech, and in his face I saw that he believed me. A moment he hesitated yet, then, "I am seeking knowledge concerning Madonna Paolo di Santafiore," he said presently, resuming, as he spoke, his seat at table. "As I told you, the body, which was believed to be dead, was stolen in the night from San Domenico. Know you aught of this? It may be an ignoble thing to lie, but with what other weapon was I to fight this brigand? Surely if an exception can be made to rule, and a lie become a meritorious thing, such an occasion as this would surely justify such an exception. I know nothing," I answered boldly, unhesitatingly, and even with a ring of truth and sincerity that was calculated to convince, "nor can I even believe this rumor. It is a wild story. That the body has been stolen may be true enough. Such things occur, though he was a bold man who laid hands upon the body of a person of such importance. But that she lives, Gesù, that is an old wife's tale. I had, myself, the word of the Lord Filippo's physician that she was dead. Nevertheless, this old wife's tale, as you dub it, is one of which I have had confirmation. Lend me your wits, Boccadoro, and you shall not regret it. Exercise them now, and conjecture me who could have abstracted the body from the church. In seeking this information, I am acting in the interest of the noble house of Borgia, which I serve and to which you was to have been allied, as you well know. I could have laughed to see how the apparent sincerity of my denial had convinced him to such an extent that he even sought my help to discover the true thief, and to account for his interest in the matter, he lied to me of his service to the house of Borgia. I will gladly lend you these wits, said I, to disprove to you the rumor which you say that you have confirmation. Let us accept the statement that the body has been stolen. That much, no doubt, is true, for even rumors require some slight foundation. But who in all this world could say that when the body was taken it was not dead? Clearly but one man, he that administered the poison. And I ask your excellency, will he be likely to tell the world what he had done? He might have answered me, I am that man. But he did not. Instead, he hung his head, as if pondering the words of wisdom I had uttered, words meant to convince him of my own innocence in the matter. And this they achieved, at least in part. He flashed me a look of sudden suspicion, it is true, but it faded almost as soon as it shone from his brooding eye. Maybe I am a fool that I do not string you up and test the truth of what you say, he grumbled. But I incline to believe you, and you are a merry rogue. You shall remain and have peace and comfort so long as you amuse me. But tremble if I discover that you have sought to deceive me. You shall have the cord first and other things after, and your death shall be the thing you will pray for long before it takes you from my vengeance. If you know aught, speak now and you shall find me merciful. Your life and liberty shall be the recompense of your honesty towards me. I repeat, excellency, I answered, without changing color, that all that I know of I already told you. He was convinced, I think, for the time being. Get you gone, then. He bade me. I have other business to deal with ere I sleep. Mariani, see that Boccadoro is well lodged. The old man bowed, and lifting a torch from its socket, he silently motioned me to go with him. I made Messer Ramiro a profound obeisance, and withdrew in the wake of the seneschal. He led me up a flight of stairs that rose from the hall, and along a gallery that ran half round it. Then plunging down a corridor, he halted presently, and, opening a door, ushered me into a tolerably furnished room. A servant followed, hanging the clothes that I had worn when I arrived. The old man lingered a moment after the servant had withdrawn, and his hollow eyes rested on me for a second. I thought that he was on the point of saying something, and I waited, returning his glance with one that quailed before the anguish of his own. I feared to speak, to offer an expression of the sympathy that filled my heart, for in that strange place I could not tell how far a man was to be trusted, even a man so wronged as this one. On his own part it may be that a like doubt beset him concerning me, for in the end he departed as he had come, no word having passed his ashen lips. Left alone, I surveyed my surroundings by the light of the taper he had left in the iron sconce on the wall. The single window overlooked the courtyard, so that even had I been disposed and able to cut through the iron that barred it, I should but succeed in falling into the hands of guards who abounded in that nest of infamy, so that, for the night at least, the notion of flight must be abandoned. What the morrow would bring forth, we must wait and see. Perhaps some way of escape would offer itself. Then my thoughts returned to Paula, and I was tortured by surmises as to her fate, and chiefly as to how she could have eluded the search that must have been made for her in the hut where I had left her. Had the peasant befriended her, I wondered, and what did she think of my protracted absence? I sat on the edge of the bed and gave rein to my conjectures. The noises in the castle had all ceased, and still I sat on, unconscious of time, my taper burning low. It may have been midnight when I was startled by the sound of a stealthy step in the corridor near my door. A heavy footfall I should have left unheeded, but this soft tread aroused me on the instant, and I sat listening. It halted at my door and was succeeded by a soft, scratching sound. Noiselessly I rose, and with ready hands I waited, prepared, in the instinct of self-preservation, to fall upon the intruder, however futile the act might be. But the door did not open as I expected. Instead, the scratching sound continued, growing slightly louder. Then it occurred to me, at last, that whoever came might be a friend craving admittance, and proceeding stealthily that others in the castle might not overhear him. Swiftly I crossed the door and opened, On the threshold, a dark figure straightened itself from a stooping posture, and the light of the taper behind me fell on a face of a pallor that seemed to glisten in its intensity. It was the face of Mariani, the seneschal of the castle of Cessna. One glance we exchanged, and intuitively I seemed to apprehend the motive of this midnight visit. He came either to bring me aid or to seek mine, with vengeance for his guerdon. I stood aside, and silently he entered my room and closed the door. "Quench your taper," he bade me in a husky whisper. Without hesitation, I obeyed him, a strange excitement thrilling me. For a second we stood in the dark. Then another light gleamed as he plucked away the cloak that masked the lantern which he had brought with him. He set the lantern on the floor and held the cloak in his hand, ready at a moment's notice to conceal the light in its folds. Then, pulling me down beside him on the bed, where he had perched himself, "My friend," said he, "it may be that I bring you assistance." "Speak, then," I bade him. "You shall not find me slow to act if there is the need or the way." "So I had surmised," he said. "Are you not that same Boccadoro, fool of the court of Pesaro, who donned the Lord Giovanni's armor and rode out to do battle in his stead?" I answered him that I was that man. "I have heard the tale," said he. "Indeed, all Italy has heard it, and knows you for a man of steel, as strong and audacious as you are cunning and resourceful. I know against what desperate odds you fought that day, and how you overcame this terrible Ramiro. This it is that leads me to hope that in the service of your own ends you may become the instrument of my vengeance." "Unfold your project, man," I muttered, fiercely almost, in my burning eagerness. "Let me hear what you would have me do." He did not answer me until a sob had shaken his old frame. "That boy," he muttered brokenly, "that golden-haired angel sent me for the consolation of my decaying years, that lad whom Ramiro destroyed so foully and wantonly, was my son." Futile though the attempt had proved, I had certainly set my hands at the tyrant's neck, but that I founded hopes on you of a surer and more terrible revenge. That thought has manned me and upheld me when anguish was near to slaying me outright. To see the boy burn so under my very eyes, God of mercy and pity, that I should have lived so long. Your child burned but a moment, suffered but an instant. For the deed, Ramiro will burn in hell through countless generations, through interminable ages. It was a paltry consolation, perhaps, but it was the best that then occurred to me. Meanwhile, I beg him, do you tell me what you would have me do? I urge him to it that he might, thereby, suffer his mind to rest a moment from pondering that ghastly thing that he had witnessed, that scene that would live before his eyes until they closed in their last sleep. You heard Lampignani equip Ramiro with the fact that 3 messengers have ridden desperately within the week from Città di Castello to Cesena, and you heard, perhaps, his obscure reference to the hat? I heard both, and both I weighed, said I. The old man looked at me as if surprised. "And what," he asked, "was the conclusion you arrived at?" "Why, simply this, that whilst the messenger bore some letter from Vitelli to Ramiro that should serve to lull the suspicions of any who, wondering at so much traffic between these two, should be moved to take a peep into those missives, the true letter with which the courier rides is concealed within the lining of his hat, probably unknown even to himself." He stared at me as though I had been a wizard. "Messer Boccadoro," he began. "My name," I corrected him, "is Biancamont, Lazzaro Biancamont." "Whatever be your name," he returned, "of the quality of your wits there can be no question. You have guessed for yourself the half of what I was come to tell you. Has your shrewdness borne you any further? Have you concluded aught concerning the nature of those letters? I have concluded that it might repay some trouble to discover what is contained in letters that are sent with so much secrecy. I can conceive nothing that might lie between the Lord of Città di Castello and this ruffian of Cesena, and yet treason lurks often where least it is expected, and treason makes stranger bedfellows in misfortune. Lampignani was no fool, and yet a great fool, the old man murmured. He surmised what you have surmised. With each of the messengers Ramiro has dealt in the same manner. He has sent each to be fed and refreshed, whilst waiting to return with the answer he was penning. For their refreshment he has ordered a very full, stout wine, not drugged, for that they might discover upon awaking, but a wine that of itself would do the work of setting them to sleep very soundly. Then, when all slept, and only he remained at table, like the drunkard that he is, it has been his habit to descend himself to the kitchen and possess himself of the messenger's hat. With this, he has returned to the hall, opened the lining, and withdrawn a letter. Then, as I suppose, he has penned his answer, thrust it into the lining, where the other one had been, and secured it, as it was before, with his own hands. He has returned the hat to the place from whence he took it, and when the courier awakens in the morning, there is another letter put into his hand, and he is bidden to bear it to Vitelli. He paused a moment, then continued. Lampugnani must have suspected something, and watched Ramiro to make sure that his suspicions were well-founded. In that he was wise, but he was a fool to allow Ramiro to see what lie he had discovered. Already he has paid the penalty. He is lying with a dagger in his throat, for an hour ago Ramiro stabbed him while he slept. I shuddered. What a place of blood was this? Could it be that Cesare Borgia had no knowledge of what things were being performed by his governor Cecina? Poor Lampugnani. I sighed. God rest his soul. I doubt, but he is in hell, answered Mariani without emotion. He was as great a villain as his master, and he has gone to answer for his villainy even as this ugly monster, a Ramiro, shall. But let Lampugnani be. I am not come to talk of him. Returning from his bloody act, Ramiro ordered me to bed. I went, and as I passed Lampugnani's room, I saw the door standing wide. It was thus that I learnt what had befallen. I remembered his words concerning the hat, and I remembered old suspicions of my own aroused by the thought of the potent wine which Ramiro had ordered me to see given to the couriers. I sped back to the gallery that overlooks the hall. Ramiro was absent, and I surmised at once that he was gone to the kitchen. Then was it that I thought of you, and of what service you might render if things were indeed, as I now more than suspected. Like an inspiration, it came to me how I might prepare your way. I ran down to the hall, sweating in my terror that he should return ere I had performed the task. I went on. From a buffet, I drew a flagon of that same stout wine that Ramiro used upon his messengers. I ripped away the seal and crimson cord by which it is distinguished, and placing it on the table, I removed the flagon I had set for him before I had first departed. Then I fled back to the gallery, and from the shadows I watched for his return. Soon he came, bearing a hat in his hand, and from that hat he took a letter, all as you have surmised. He read it, and I saw his face lighten with fierce excitement. Then he helped himself freely to wine, and drank thirstily, for all that he was overladen with it. One of the qualities of this wine is that in quenching thirst it produces yet a greater. Ramiro drank again, then sat with the letter before him in the light of the single taper I had left burning. Presently he grew sleepy. He shook himself and drank again. Then again he sat conning his epistle, and thus I left him and came hither in quest of you. There followed a pause. Well, I asked at length, what is it you would have me do? Stab him as he sleeps? He shook his head. That were too sweet and sudden a death for him. If it had been no more than a matter of that, my old arms would have lent me strength enough. But think you it would repay me for having seen my boy pinned by that monster's pike to the burning logs? What is it, then, you ask of me? If that letter were indeed the treasonable document we accounted, if its treason should be aimed at Cesare Borgia, it could scarce be aimed at another. Would it not be a sweet thing to obtain possession of it? Aye. But when he wakes tomorrow and finds it gone, what then? You know this governor of Cecina well enough to be assured that he would ransack the castle, torture, rack, burn and flay us all until the missive were forthcoming. That, he groaned, is what deterred me. If I had the means of getting the letter sent to Cesare Borgia, or of escaping with it myself from Cecina, I should not have hesitated. Cesare Borgia is lying at Faenza, and I could ride there in a day, but it would be impossible for me to leave the place before morning. I have duties to perform in the town, and I might get away whilst I am about them, but before then the letter will have been missed, and no one will be allowed to leave the citadel. Why, then, said I, the only hope lies in abstracting that letter in such a manner that he shall not suspect the loss, and that seems a very desperate hope. We sat in silence for some moments, during which I thought intently to little purpose. Does he sleep yet, think you? I asked presently. Assuredly he must. And if I were to go to the gallery, is there any fear that I should be discovered by others? None. All at Cecina are asleep by now. Then, said I, rising, let's take a look at him. Who knows what may suggest itself? Come. I moved toward the door, and he took up his lantern and followed me, enjoining me to tread lightly. Chapter 18. The Letter. On tiptoe, I crept down that corridor to the gallery above the banqueting hall, secure from sight in the enveloping darkness, and intent upon allowing no sound to betray my presence, lest Ramiro should have awakened. Behind me, treading as lightly, came Messer Mariani. Thus we gained the gallery. I leaned against the stout oaken balustrade and looked down into the black pit of the hall, broken in the center by the circle of light from the two tapers that burned upon the table. The other torches had all been quenched. At the table sat Messer Ramiro, his head fallen forward and sideways upon his right arm, which was outstretched and limp along the board. Before him lay a paper which I inferred to be the letter, whose possession might mean so much. I could hear the old man breathing heavily beside me as I leaned there in the dark, and sought to devise a means by which that paper might be obtained. No doubt it would be the easiest thing in the world to snatch it away without disturbing him. But there was always to be considered that when he waked and missed the letter, we should have to reckon with his measures to regain possession of it. It became necessary, therefore, to go about it in a manner that should leave him unsuspicious of the theft. A little while I pondered this, deeming the thing desperate at first. Then an idea came to me on a sudden, and turning to Mariani, I asked him could he find me a sheet of paper of about the size of that letter held by Ramiro. He answered me that he could, and bade me wait there until he should return. I waited, watching the sleeper below, my excitement waxing with every second of the delay. Ramiro was snoring now, a loud, sonorous snore that rang like a trumpet blast through that vast, empty hall. At last Mariani returned, bringing the sheet of paper I had asked for, and he was full of questions of what I intended. But neither the place nor the time was one in which to stand unfolding plans. Every moment wasted increased the uncertainty of the success of my design. Someone might come, or Ramiro might awaken despite the potency of the wine he had been given, for on so well seasoned a tope of the most potent of wines could have but a transient effect. So I left Mariani and moved swiftly and silently to the head of the staircase. I had gone down 2 steps, when, in the dark, I missed the third, the bells of my cap jangling at the shock. I brought my teeth together and stood breathless in apprehension, fearing that the noise might awaken him, and cursing myself for a careless fool to have forgotten those infernal bells. Above me, I heard a warning hiss from old Mariani, which, if anything, increased my dread. But Ramiro snored on, and I was reassured. A moment I stood debating whether I should go on, or first return to divest myself of that cap of mine. In the end, I decided to pursue the latter course. The need for swift and sudden movement might come ere I was done with this adventure, and those bells might easily be the undoing of me. So back I went to the surprise and infinite dismay of Mariani until I had whispered in his ear the reason. We retreated together to the corridor, and there, with his help, I removed my jangling headgear, which I left him to restore to my chamber. Whilst he went upon that errand, I returned once more on mine, and this time I gained the foot of the stairs without mishap, and stood in the hall. Ramiro's back was towards me. On my right stood the tall buffet from which the boy had fetched him wine that evening. This I marked out as a cover to which I must fly in case of need. A second I stood hesitating, still considering my course. Then I went softly forward, my feet making no sound in the rushes of floor. I had covered half the distance, and, growing bolder, I was advancing more swiftly and with less caution, when suddenly my knee came in contact with a 3-legged stool that had been carelessly left where none would have suspected it. The blow may have hurt afterwards. Indeed, I was conscious of a soreness at the knee, but at the moment I had no thought or care for physical pain. The bench went over with a crash, and for all that the rushes may have deadened in part the sound of its fall, to my nervous ear it boomed like the report of a cannon through the stillness of the place. I turned cold as ice, and the sweat of fear sprang out to moisten me from head to foot. Instantly I dropped on all fours, lest Ramiro, awaking suddenly, should turn, and I waited for the least sign that should render advisable my seeking the cover of the buffet. In the gallery above, I could picture old Mariani clenching his teeth at the noise, his knees knocking together, and his face white with horror, for Ramiro's snoring had abruptly ceased. It came to an end with a choking catch of the breath, and I looked to see him raise his head and start up to ascertain what it was that had aroused him. But he never stirred, and for all that he no longer snored, his breathing continued heavy and regular, so that I was cheered by the assurance that I had but disturbed his slumber, not dispelled it. Yet, since I had disturbed and lightened it, a greater precaution was now necessary, and I waited there for some 10 minutes, maybe, a period that must have proved a very eternity to the old man upstairs. At last I had the reward of hearing the snoring recommence. Lightly at first, but soon with all its former fullness. I rose and proceeded now with a caution that must guard me from any more unlooked-for obstacles. Moreover, as I approached, the darkness was dispelled more and more at every stride in the direction of the light. At last I reached the table, and stood silent as a specter at Ramiro's side, looking down upon the features of the sleeping man. His face was flushed, and his tawny hair tumbled about his damp brow. His lips quivered as he breathed. For a moment, as I stood gazing on him, there was murder in my mind. His dagger hung temptingly in his girdle. To have drawn it and rid the world of this monster might have been a worthy deed, acceptable in the eyes of heaven. But how should it profit me? Rather must it prove my destruction at the hands of his followers, and to be destroyed just then, with Paula depending upon me, and life full of promise once I regained my liberty, was something I had no mind to risk. My eyes wandered to the letter lying on the table. If this were of the nature we suspected, it should prove a safer tool for his destruction. To read it as it lay was an easy matter, and it came to me then that ere I decide upon my course it might be well that I should do so. If by chance it were innocent of treason, why, then, I might resort to the risk of that other and more desperate weapon, his own dagger. At the foot of the short flight of steps that led from the hall to the courtyard, I could hear the slow pacing of the sentry placed there by Ramiro. But unless he were summoned, it was extremely unlikely that the fellow would leave his post, so that, I concluded, I had little to fear from that quarter. I drew back and taking up a position behind Ramiro's chair, a position more favorable to escape in the untoward event of his awaking, I craned forward to read the letter over his shoulder. I thanked God in that hour for two things: that my sight was keen, and that Vitellozzo Vitelli wrote a large, bold hand. Scarcely breathing, and distracted a while by the mad racing of my pulses, I read. And this, as nearly as I can remember, is what the letter contained. Illustrious Ramiro, your answer to my last letter reached me safely, and it rejoiced me to learn that you had found a man for our undertaking. See that you have him in readiness, for the hour of action is at hand. Cesare goes south on the 2nd or 3rd day of the new year, and he has announced to me his intention of passing through Cesena on his way, there to investigate certain charges of maladministration which have been preferred against you. These concern, in particular, certain misappropriation of grain in stores, and an excessive severity of rule, of which complaints have reached him. From this you will gather that out of a spirit of self-defense, if not to earn the reward which we have bound ourselves to pay you, it is expedient that you should not fail us. The occasion of the Duke's visit to Cesena will be, of all, the most propitious for our purpose. Have your arbalister posed, and may God strengthen his arm, and render true his aim to the end, that Italy may be rid of a tyrant. I commend myself to your excellency, and I shall anxiously await your news. Vitellozzo Vitelli. Here indeed were my hopes realized. A plot there was, and it aimed at nothing less than the Duke of Valentino's life. Let that letter be borne to Cesare Borgia Faenza, and I would warrant that within a dozen hours of his receipt of it, he would so dispose that all who had suffered by the cruel tyranny of Ramiro del Orca would be avenged, and those who were still suffering would be relieved. In this letter lay my own freedom and the salvation of Madonna Paula, and this letter behoved me at once to become possessed. It was a safer far alternative than that dagger of his. A moment I stood pondering the matter for the last time, then stepping sideways and forward, so that I was again beside him, I put out my hand and swiftly whipped the letter from the table. Then, standing very still, to prevent the slightest rustle, I remained a second or two observing him. He snored on, undisturbed by my light-fingered action. I drew away a pace or two, as lightly as I might, and folding the letter, I thrust it into my girdle. Then from my open doublet, I drew the sheet that Mariani had supplied me, and, advancing again, I placed it on the table in a position almost identical with that which the original had occupied, saving that it was removed a half-finger's breadth from his hand, for I feared to allow it actually to touch him lest it should arouse him. Holding my breath, For now, as I come to the most desperate part of my undertaking, I caught up one of the tapers and set fire to a corner of the sheet. That done, I left the candle lying on its side against the paper, so as to convey the impression to him, when presently he awakened, that it had fallen from its sconce. Then, without waiting for more, I backed swiftly away, watching the progress of the flames as they devoured the paper, and presently reached his hand and scorched it. At that I dropped again on all fours, and having gained the corner of the fay, I crouched there, even as with a sudden scream of pain he woke and sprang upright, shaking his blistered hand. As a matter of instinct, he looked about to see what had hurt him. Then his eyes fell upon the charred paper on the table and the fallen candle, which was still burning across one end of it. And even to the dull wits of Ramiro del Orca, the only possible conclusion was suggested. He stared at it a moment, then swept that flimsy sheet of ashes from the table with an oath, and sank back once more into his great leathern chair. "Body of God," he swore aloud, "it is well that I had read it 12 times. Better that it should have been burnt than that someone should have read it whilst I slept." The idea of such a possibility seemed to rouse him to fresh action, for seizing the fallen candle and replacing it in its socket, he rose once more, and holding it high above his head, he looked about the hall. The light it shed may have been feeble, and the shadows about my buffet thick. But, as I have said, my doublet was open, and some ray of that weak candlelight must have found out the white shirt that was showing at my breast, for with a sudden cry, he pushed back his chair, and took a step towards me, no doubt intent upon investigating that white something that he saw gleaming there. I waited for no more. I had no fancy to be caught in that corner, utterly at his mercy. I stood up suddenly. "Magnificent, it is I announced with a calm and boundless effrontery. The boldness of it may have staggered him a little, for he paused, although his eyes were glowing horribly with the frenzy that possessed him, the half of which was drunkenness, the other fear and wrath lest I should have seen his treacherous communication from Vitelli. "What make you here?" he questioned threateningly. "I thirsted, Excellency," I answered glibly. "I thirsted, and I bethought me of this buffet where you keep your wine." He continued to eye me, some 6 paces off, his half-drunken wits no doubt weighing the plausibility of my answer. At last, "If that be all, what cause had you to hide?" he asked me shrewdly. "One of your candles fell over and awakened you," said I. "I feared you might resent my presence, and so I hid." "You came not near the table?" he inquired. "You saw nothing of the paper that I held?" "Nay, by the host." "I'll take no risks. You were born neath an unlucky star, fool. For be your reason for your presence here no more than you assert, you have come in a season that must be fatal to you." He set the candle on the table. Then, carrying his hand to his girdle, he withdrew it sharply, and I caught the gleam of a dagger. In that instant, I thought of Mariani waiting above, and like a flash it came to me that if I could outpace this drunken brigand, and, gaining the gallery well ahead of him, transfer that letter to the old man's hands, I should not die in vain. Cesare Borgia would avenge me, and Madonna Paola, at least, would be safe from this villain. If Mariani could reach Valentino at Faenza, I would answer for it that within 24 hours Messer Ramiro del Orca will be the banner on that ghastly beam that he facetiously dubbed his flagstaff, and he will be the blackest, dirtiest banner that ever yet had fluttered there. The thought conceived in the twinkling of an eye, I acted upon without a second's hesitation. Ere Ramiro had taken his first step towards me, I had sprung to the stairs, and I was leaping up them with the frantic speed of one upon whose heels death is treading closely. A singular, fierce joy was blent with my measured fear, a joy at the thought that even now, in this extremity, I was outwitting him, for never a doubt had he that the burnt paper he had found on the table was all that was left of Vitelli's letter. His fears were that I might have read it, but never a suspicion crossed his mind of such a trick as I had played upon him. So I sped on, the gigantic Ramiro blundering after me, panting and blaspheming, for although powerful, his bulk and the wine he had taken left him no nimbleness. The distance between us widened, and if only Mariani would have the presence of mind to wait for me at the mouth of the passage, all would be as I could wish it before his dagger found my heart. I was assuring myself of this when in the dark I stumbled, and striking my legs against the stair, I hurtled forward. I recovered almost immediately, but in my frenzy of haste to make up for the instant lost, I stumbled a second time ere I was well upon my feet. With a roar, Ramiro must have hurled himself forward, for I felt my ankle caught in a grip from which there was no escaping, and I was roughly and brutally dragged back and down those stairs. Now my head, now my breast beating against the steps as I descended them one by one. But even in that hour, the letter was my first thought, and I found a way to thrust it farther under my girdle so that it should not be seen. At last I reached the hall, half stunned, and with all the misery of defeat and the certainty of the futility of my death to further torture my last moments. Over me stood Ramiro, his dagger upheld, ready to strike. "Dog," he taunted me, "your sands are run. Mercy magnificent." I gasped, "I have done nothing to deserve your poniard." He laughed brutally, delaying his stroke that he might prolong my agony for his drunken entertainment. "Address your prayers to heaven," he mocked me, "and let them concern your soul." And then, like a flash of inspiration, came the words that should delay his hand. "Spare me," I cried, "for I am in mortal sin." Impious, abandoned villain, though he was, he said too much when he boasted that he feared neither God nor devil. He was prone to forget his God, and the lessons that as a babe he had learned at his mother's knee. For I take it that even Ramiro del Orca had once been a babe. But deep down in his soul, there remained the fear of hell and an almost instinctive obedience to the laws of Mother Church. He could perform such ruthless cruelties as that of hurling a page into the fire to punish his clumsiness. He could rack and stab and hang men with the least shadow of compunction or twinge of conscience. But to slay a man who professed himself to be in mortal sin was a deed too appalling even for this ruthless butcher. He hesitated a second, then he lowered his hand, his face telling me clearly how deeply he grudged me the respite which, yet, he dared not do other than accord me. "Where shall I find me a priest?" he grumbled. "Think you the citadel of Cecina is a monastery? I will wait while you make an act of contrition for your sins. It is all the shrift I can afford you. And get it done, for it is time I was abed. You shall have 5 minutes in which to clear your soul." By this it seemed to me, as it may well seem to you, that matters were but little mended. And instead of employing the respite he accorded me in the pious collecting of thoughts which he enjoined, I sat up, very sore from my descent of the stairs, and employed those precious moments in putting forward arguments to turn him from his murderous purpose. "I have lived too ungodly a life," I protested, "to be able to squeeze into paradise through so narrow a tate. As you would hope for your own ultimate salvation, Excellency, I do beseech you not to imperil mine." This disposed him, at least, to listen to me, and proceeded to assure him of the harmless nature of my visit to the hall in quest of wine to quench my thirst. I was running the grave risk of dying with lies on my lips, but I was too desperate to give the matter thought just then. His mood seemed to relent. The delay, perhaps, had calmed his first access of passion, and he was grown more reasonable. But when Ramiro cooled, he was, perhaps, more malignant than ever, for men return in natural condition, and Ramiro's natural condition was one of cruelty unsurpassed. "It may be as you say," he answered me at last, sheathing his dagger, "and at least you have my word that I will not slay you without first assuring myself that you have lied. For tonight you shall remain in durance. Tomorrow we will apply the question to you." The hope that had been reviving in my breast fell dead once more, and I turned cold at that threat. And yet, between now and tomorrow, much might betide, and I had cause for thankfulness, perhaps for this respite. Thus I sought to cheer myself. But I fear I failed. Tomorrow he would torture me, not so much to ascertain whether I had spoken truly, but because to his diseased mind it afforded diversion to witness a man's anguish. No doubt it was that it urged him now to spare my life, and accord me this merciless piece of mercy. In a loud voice he called the sentry who was pacing below, and in a moment a man appeared in answer to that summons. "You will take this knave to the chamber set apart for him up there, and you will leave him secure under lock and bar, bringing me the key of his door." The fellow informed himself which was the chamber. Then turning to me, he curtly bade me go with him. Thus was I haled back to my room, with the promise of horrors on the morrow, but with a night before me in which to scheme and pray for some miracle that might yet save me. But the days of miracles were long past. I lay on my bed and deplored with many a sigh that bitter fact. And if all had been wanting to increase the weight of fear and anguish on my already overburdened mind, and to aid in what almost seemed an infernal plot to utterly distract me, I had it in fresh, wild conjectures touching Madonna Paula. Where indeed could she be that Ramiro's men had failed to find her for all that they had scoured that part of the country in which I had left her to wait for my return? What if by now, Worse had befallen her than the capture with which Ramiro's lieutenant was charged. With such doubts as these to haunt me, fretted as I was by my utter inability to take a step in her service, I lay there for an hour or so in such agony of mind as is begotten only of suspense. In my girdle still reposed a treasonable letter from Vitelli to Ramiro, a mighty weapon with which to accomplish the butcher's overthrow. But how was I to wield it imprisoned here? I wondered why Mariani had not returned, only to remember that the soldier who had locked me and had carried the key of my prison chamber to Ramiro. Suddenly the stillness was disturbed by a faint tap at my door. My instincts and my reason told me it must be Mariani at last. In an instant I had leapt from the bed and whispered through the keyhole, "Who is there?" "It is I, Mariani, the seneschal," came the old man's voice very softly, but nevertheless distinctly. "They have taken the key." I groaned. Then in a gust of passion, I fell to cursing Ramiro for that precaution. "You have the letter?" Came Mariani's voice again. I have it still," I answered. "Have you seen what it contains?" "A plot to assassinate the Duke, no less. Enough to get this bloody Ramiro broken on the wheel." I was answered by a sound that was as a gasp of malicious joy. Then the old man's voice added, "Can you pass it under the door? There's a sufficient gap." I felt, and found that he was right. I could pass the half of my hand underneath. I took the letter and thrust it through. His hands fastened on it instantly, almost snatching it from my fingers before they were ready to release it. "Have courage," he bade me. "Listen, I shall endeavor to leave Cecina in the morning, and I shall ride straight for Faenza. If I find the Duke there when I arrive, he should be here within some 12 or 14 hours of my departure. Fence with Ramiro. Temporize if you can till then, and all will be well with you." "I will do what I can," I answered him. "But if he slays me in the meantime, at least I shall have the satisfaction of knowing that he will not be long in following me." "May God shield you," he said fervently. "May God speed you," I answered him with a still greater fervor. That night, as you may well conceive, I slept but little and that little ill. The morning, instead of relieving the fears that in the darkness had been with me, seemed to increase them. For now was the time for Mariani to act, and I was fearful as to how he might succeed. I was full of doubts lest some obstacle should have arisen to prevent his departure from Cecina, and I spent my morning in wearisome speculation. I took an almost childish satisfaction in the thought that since, being a prisoner, I could no longer count myself the fool of the court of Cecina, I was free to strip the motley and assume the more sober garments in which I had been taken, and which, as you may recall, had been placed in my chamber on the previous evening. It was the very plainest raiment. For doublet I wore a buff brigandine, quilted and dagger-proof, and caught at the waist by a girdle of hammered steel. My wine-colored hose was stout and serviceable, as were my long boots of untanned leather. Yet prouder was I of this sober apparel than ever king of his ermine. It may have been an hour or so past noon when, at last, my solitude was invaded by a soldier who came to order me into the presence of the governor. I had been sitting at the window, leaning against the bars and looking out at the desolate white landscape, for there had been a heavy fall of snow in the night, which reminded me, as snow ever did, of my first meeting with Madonna Paula. I rose upon the instant, and my fears rose with me. But I kept a bold front as I went down into the hall, where Ramiro and the blackguards of his court were sitting, with 3 or 4 men-at-arms at attention by the door. Close to the pulleys appertaining to the torture of the cord stood 2 leather-clad ruffians, Ramiro's executioners. At the head of the board, which was still strewn with fragment of food for they had but dined, sat Ramiro del Orca. With him were 6 of his officers, whose villainous appearance pronounced them worthy of their brutal leader. The air was heavy with the pungent odor of viands. I looked round for Mariani, and I took some comfort from the fact that he was absent. Might heaven please that he was even then on his way to Faenza. Ramiro watched my advance with a smile in which mockery was blent with satisfaction. For all the resumption of my proper raiment, he seemed to take no heed. No doubt he had dined well, and he was now disposing himself to be amused. "Messer Boccadoro," said he, when I had come to a standstill, "there was last night a matter that was not cleared up between us, and concerning which I express an intention of questioning you today. I should proceed to do so at once, were it not that there is yet another matter on which I am, if possible, still more desirous you should tell us all you know." Once already have you evaded my questions with answers which at the time I half believed. Even now I do not say that I utterly disbelieve them, but I wish to assure myself that you told the truth. For if you lied, why then we may still be assisted by such information the court shall squeeze from you. I am referring to the mysterious disappearance of Madonna Paula di Santafiore, a disappearance of which you have assured me that you knew nothing, being even in ignorance of the fact that the lady was not really dead. I had confidently expected that the parties searching for Madonna Paula would have succeeded ere this in finding her. But this morning my hopes suffered disappointment. My men have returned empty-handed once more, for which mercy may heaven be praised. I burst out. He scowled at me. Then he laughed evilly. My men have returned, all save 3. Captain Lucagnolo, with 2 of his followers, has undertaken to go beyond the area I appointed for the search, and to proceed to the village of Cattolica. While he is pursuing his inquiries there, I have resolved to pursue my own here. I now call upon you, Boccadoro, to tell us what you know of Madonna Paola's whereabouts. I know nothing, I answered stoutly. I am prepared to take oath that I know nothing of her whereabouts. Tell me, then, at least, said he, where you bestowed her. I shook my head, pressing my lips tight. Do you think that I would tell you if I had the knowledge? Was the scornful question with which I answered him. You may pursue your inquiries as you will and where you will, but I pray God they may all prove as futile as must those that you would pursue here and upon my own person. This was how I fenced with him. This was the manner in which I followed Mariani's sound advice that I should temporize. Oh, I know that my words are the words of a fool, yet no fear that Ramiro would inspire me could have restrained them. There was a murmur at the table, and his fellows turned their eyes on Ramiro to see how he would receive this bearding. He smiled quietly, and raising his hand, he made a sign to the executioners. Rude hands seized me from behind, and the doublet was torn from my back by fingers that never paused to untruss my points. They turned me about and hurried me along until I stood under the pulleys of the torture, and one of the men held me securely whilst the other passed cords about my wrists. Then both the executioners stepped back, to be ready to hoist me at the governor's signal. He delayed it, much as an epicure delays the consumption of a delectable morsel, heightening by suspense the keen desire of his palate. He watched me closely, and had my lips quivered or my eyelids fluttered, he would have hailed with joy such signs of weakness. But I take pride in truthfully writing that I stood bold and impassively before him, and if I was pale, I thank heaven that pallor was a habit of my countenance, so that from that he gathered no satisfaction. And standing there, I gave him back look for look and waited. For the last time, Boccadoro, he said slowly, attempting by words to shake a demeanor that was proof against the impending fact of cord, I ask you to remember what must be the consequences of this stubbornness. If not at the first hoist, why then at the second or the third, the torture will compel you to disclose what you may know. Would you not be better advised to speak at once, while your limbs are soundly planted in their sockets, rather than let yourself be maimed, perhaps for life, ere you will do so? There was a stir of hoofs without. They thundered on the planks of the drawbridge and clattered on the stones of the courtyard. The thought of Cesare Borgia rose to my mind, but never did drowning man clutch at a more illusory straw. Cold reason quenched my hope at once. If the greatest imaginable success attended Mariani's journey, the Duke could not reach Cesena before midnight, and to that it wanted some 10 hours at least. Moreover, the company that came was small to judge by the sound, a half-dozen horses at the most. But Ramiro's attention had been diverted from me by the noise. Half turning in his chair, he called to one of the men-at-arms to ascertain who came. Before the fellow could do his bidding, the door was thrust open and Lucagnolo appeared on the threshold, jaded and worn with hard riding. A certain excitement arose in me at sight of him, despite my confidence that he must be returning empty-handed. Ramiro rose, pushed back his chair, and advanced towards a newcomer. "Well," he demanded, "what news?" "Excellency, the girl is here." That answer seemed to turn me into stone. So great was the shock of the sudden shattering of the confidence that it sustained me. "My search and country failing," pursued the captain, as he came forward, "I made bold to exceed your orders by pushing my inquiries as far as the village of Cattolica. There I found her after some little labor. Surely I dreamt. Surely I told myself this was not possible. There was some mistake. Lucagnolo had drought someone whom he believed to be Madonna Paola. But even as I was assuring myself of this, the door opened again, and between two men-at-arms, white as death, her garments stained with mud and all but reduced to rags, and her eyes wild with a great fear, came my beloved Paola. With a sound that was as a grunt of satisfaction, Ramiro strode forward to meet her, but her eyes traveled past him and rested upon me. Standing there between the leather-clad executioners with the cords of the torture pinioning my wrists, and I saw the anguish deepen in their blue depths. Chapter 19. Doomed. Across the length of that hall our eyes met, hers and mine, and held each other's glances. To me the room and all within it formed an indistinct and misty picture, from out of which there clearly gleamed my Paola's sweet, white face. All at the table had risen with Ramiro, and now, copying their leader, they bared their heads in outward token of such respect as certainly would have been felt by any men less abandoned than were they before so much saintly beauty and distress. Lucagnolo had stepped aside, and Ramiro was now bowing low and ceremoniously before Madonna. His face I could not see, since his back was toward me, but his tones, as they flowed across the hall to where I stood, came laden with subservience. "Madonna, I give praise and thanks to heaven for this," said he. "I was afflicted by the gravest misgivings for your safety, and I am more than thankful to behold you safe and sound." There was a hypocritical flavor of courtliness about his words, and a mincing of his tones that suggested the efforts of a bull calf to imitate the warbling of a throstle. Madonna paid him no heed. Indeed, she appeared not to have heard him, for her eyes continued to look past him and at me. At last her lips parted, and although she scarcely seemed to raise her voice above a whisper, the word uttered reached my ears across the stillness of the great room, and the word was Lazzaro. At mention of my name, at the tone in which it was uttered, a tone that betrayed same measure what was in her heart, Ramiro wheeled sharply in my direction, his brows wrinkling. A certain craftiness he had, for all that I ever account him the dullest witted clod that ever rose to his degree of honor. He must have realized how expedient it was that in all he did he should present himself to Madonna in a favorite light. "Release him," he bade the executioners that held me, and in an instant I was set free. The order given, he turned again to Madonna. "You have been torturing him," she cried, and her words were hard and fierce, her eyes blazing. "You shall repent it. Ser Ramiro, the Lord Cesare Borgia, shall hear of it." Her anger betrayed her more and more, and however hidden it may have been to her, to me it was exceeding clear that she was encompassing my destruction. Ramiro laughed easily. "Madonna, you are at fault. We have not been torturing him, though I confess that we were on the point of putting him to the question. But your timely arrival has saved his limbs, for the question we were asking him concerned your whereabouts." I would have shouted to her to be wary how she answered him, for some premonition how he was about to trick her entered my mind. But realizing the futility of such a course, I held my peace and waited agonizedly. "You had tortured him in vain, then," she answered scornfully, "for Lazzaro Biancamont would never have betrayed me, nor could he have betrayed me if he would. For after your men had searched the hut in which I was hidden, I walked to Cattolica thinking foolishly that I should be safer there." Lack-a-day, she had told him the very thing he had sought to know. Yet to make doubly sure, he pursued the scent a little farther. "Indeed, it seems to me that had I tortured him, I had given him no more than he deserved for having abandoned you in that hut. Madonna, I tremble to think of the harm that might have come to you through that knave's desertion." And he scowled across at me, much as the Pharisee might have scowled upon the publican. "He is no knave," she answered, and I could have groaned to hear her working my undoing, though not by so much as a sign might I inspire her with caution, for that sign must have been seen by others. Nor did he abandon me. He left me only to go in quest of the necessaries for our journey. If harm has come to me, the blame of it must not rest on him. "Of what harm do you speak, Madonna?" he cried, in a voice laden with concern. "Of what harm?" she echoed, eyeing him with scorn that would have slain him had he any manhood left. "Of what harm? Mother of mercy, defend me. Do you ask the question? What greater harm could have come to me than to have fallen into the hands of Ramiro del Orca and his brigands?" He stood looking at her, and I doubt not that his face was a very picture of simulated consternation. "Surely, Madonna, you do not understand that we are your friends, that you can so abuse us. But you will be faint, Madonna," he cried, with a fresh and deep solicitude. a cup of wine, and he waved his hand towards the table. It would poison me, I think, she answered coldly. You are cruel and, alas, mistrustful, said he. Can you guess nothing of the anxiety that has been mine these 2 days, of the fears that have haunted me as I thought of you and your wanderings? Her lip curled, and her face took on some slight vestige of color. Her spirit was a thing for which I might then have come to love her had it not been that already I loved her to distraction. Yes, said she, I can guess something of your dismay when you found your schemes frustrated, when you found that you had come too late to San Domenico. Will you not forgive me that shift to which my adoration drove me? He implored in a honeyed voice, and a more fearful thing than Ramiro the butcher was Ramiro the lover. At that scarcely covert avowal of his passion, she recoiled a step, as she might before a thing unclean. The little color faded from her cheek, the scorn departed from her lip, and a sickly, deadly fear overspread her lovely face. God, that I should stand there and witness this insult to the woman I adored and worshipped with a fervor that the Church seeks to instill into us for those about the throne of heaven. It might not be. A blind access of fury took me. Of the consequences, I thought nothing. Reason left me utterly, and the slight hope that might lie in temporizing was disregarded. Before those about me could guess my purpose, or those others, too engrossed in the scene at the far end of the hall, could intervene, I had sprung from between the executioners and dashed across the space that separated me from the governor of Cesena. One well-aimed blow, and there should be an end to Messer Ramiro. That was the only thought that found room in my disordered mind. One or two there were who cried out as I sped past them, swift as a hound when it speeds after the fleeing hare. But I was upon Ramiro ere any could have sufficiently mastered his surprise to interfere. By the nape of his great neck, I caught him from behind, and setting my knee at his spine, I wrenched him backward, and so flung him over on the floor. Down I went with him, my hand reaching for the dagger at his jeweled girdle, and I had found and drawn it in that swift action of mine ere he had bethought him of his hands. Up it flashed and down. I sank into the crimson velvet of his rich doublet straight at the spot where his heart should be, if he were so human as to have a heart. The next instant I turned cold and sick. My desperate effort had been all for nothing. In my hand I was left with the bronze hilt of his great poniard. The blade had broken off against the mesh of steel the coward wore beneath his finery. There was a rush of feet about us, a piercing scream from Madonna Paula. It was to her that I owed my life in that grim moment. A dozen blades were naked and would have transfixed me as I lay, but that she covered my body with her own and bade them strike at me through her. A moment later, and the powerful hands of the governor of Cesena were at my throat. I was lifted and tossed aside, as though I had been a hound and he the bull I had beset. And as he swung me over and crushed me to the ground, he knelt above me and grinned horribly into my purpling face. A second we stayed so, and I thought indeed that my hour was come, when suddenly I felt the blood in my head release once more. He had taken his hands from my throat. He seized me now by the collar and dragged me rudely to my feet. Take this knave and lock him in his chamber, he bade a couple of his bravi. I may have need of him ere he dies. Messer Ramiro, came the interceding voice of Madonna Paula. What he did for me, you will not let him die for it. There was a pause during which he looked at her, whilst the men were roughly dragging me across the hall. Who knows, Madonna? He said, with a bow and an infernal smile. If you were to beg his life, it might even come to pass that I might spare it. He did not wait for her answer, but stepping after me, he called to the men that led me. In obedience they halted, and he came forward. We were now at the foot of the staircase. Boccadoro, said he, planting himself before me, and eyeing me with eyes that were very full of malice. You will recall the punishment I promised you if I came to discover it was you had thwarted me in Pesaro. It is the second time you have fooled Ramiro del Orca. There does not live the man who can boast that he did it thrice, nor will I risk it that you be that man. Make your peace with heaven, for at sunset, in an hour's time, you hang. There is one little thing that might save you even yet, and if you find life sweet, you would do well to pray that that little thing may come to pass. I answered him nothing, but I bowed my head in token that I had heard, and he signed to the men to proceed with me. Whilst turning on his heel, he stepped down the hall again to where Madonna Paula, overcome with weakness, had sunk upon a stool. As I was leaving the gallery, I had a last glimpse of her, sitting there with drawn face and haggard eyes that followed me as I passed from her sight, whilst Ramiro del Orca stood beside her murmuring words that did not reach me. His so-called courtiers and his men-at-arms were trooping out of the room, no doubt in obedience to his dismissal. Chapter 20. The Sunset. I have heard tell of the calm that comes upon brave men when hope is dead and their doom has been pronounced. Uncertainty may have tortured and made coward of them, but once that uncertainty is dissolved and suspense is at an end, resignation enters their soul, and possessing it gives to their bearing a noble and dignified peace. By the mercy of heaven they are made, maybe, to see how poor and evanescent a thing is life, and they come to realize that since to die is a necessity there is no avoiding, as well might it betide today as 10 years hence. Such a mood, however, came not to soothe that last hour of mine, and yet I account myself no coward. It was an hour of such torture and anguish as never before I had experienced, much though I had undergone, and the source of all my suffering lay in the fact that Madonna Paula was in the hands of the ogre Cecina. Had it not been for that most untoward circumstance, I almost believe that while I waited for the sun to set on that December afternoon, my mood had not only been calm, but even in some measure joyous. For it must have comforted my last moments to reflect that for all that Messer Ramiro was about to hang me, yet had I sown the seeds of his own destruction ere he had brought me to this pass. I did, indeed, reflect upon it, and it may even be that, in spite of all, I culled some grain of comfort from the reflection. But let that be. My narrative would drag wearily were I to digress, that I might tell you at length the ugly course of my thoughts, whilst the sands of my last hour were running swiftly out. For, after all, my concern and yours is with the story of Lazaro Biancamont, sometime known as Boccadoro the Fool, and not with his philosophies so unprofitable that it can benefit no man that I should set them down. My windows face west, and so I was able to watch the fall of sun, and measure by its shortening distance from the horizon the ebbing of my poor life. At last the nether rim of that round, fiery orb was on the point of touching the line of distant hills. It was casting a crimson glow along the white, snow-sheeted landscape that was singularly suggestive of the tide of blood, a very fitting tide to flow and ebb about the walls of the castle of Cecina. One little thing that was might save me, Ramiro had said, but I had shut the thought out of my mind to keep me from utter distraction. The only little thing in which I held that my salvation could lie would be in the miraculous arrival of Cesare Borgia, and of that not the faintest hope existed. If the greatest luck attended Mariani's errand, and the greatest speed were made by the Duke once he received the letter, he could not reach Cecina in less than another 8 hours. And another 8 minutes, to reckon by the swift sinking of the sun, would see the time appointed for my hanging. I thought of Joshua in that grim hour, and in a mood that approached the whimsical, I envied him his gift. If I could have stayed the setting of the sun, and held it where it was till midnight, all might yet be well if Mariani had been diligent and Cesare swift. The key grating in the lock put an end to my vague musings, and reminded me of the fact that I had neglected to employ that last hour as would have become a good son of Mother Church. For an instant I believed that my heart turned me to thoughts of God, and sent up a prayer for mercy for my poor sinful soul. Then the door swung wide. 2 halberdiers and a carnifex in his odious leathern apron stood before me. Clearly Ramiro sought to be exact, and to have me hanging the instant the sun should vanish. "It is time," said one of the soldiers, whilst the executioner, stepping into my chamber, pinioned my wrist behind me, and retaining hold of the cord bade me march. He followed, holding that slender cord, and so, like a beast of the shambles, went I. Once more they led me into the hall, where the shadows were lengthening in dark contrast to the splashes of sunlight that lingered on the floor, and whose blood-red hue was deepened by the gules of the windows through which it was filtered. Ramiro was waiting for me, and 6 of his officers were in attendance. But, for once, there were no men-at-arms at hand. On a chair, the one usually occupied by Ramiro himself, sat Madonna Paula, still in her torn and bedraggled raiment, her face white, her eyes wild as they had been when first she had been haled into Ramiro's presence, some 2 hours ago, and her features so rigidly composed that it told the tale of the awful self-control she must be exerting, a self-control that might end with sudden snap that would plunge her into madness. A wild rage possessed me at sight of her. Let Ramiro be ruthless and cruel where men were concerned. That was a thing for which forgiveness might be found him. But that he should submit a lady, delicately nurtured as was Madonna, to such horrors as she had undergone since she had awakened from his sleeping potion in the church of San Domenico, was something for which no hell could punish him condignly. Ramiro met me with a countenance through the assumed gravity of which I could espy his wicked, infernal mockery peeping forth. "I deplore your end, Lazaro Biancamont," said he slowly, "for you are a brave man, and brave men are rare. You were worthy of better things, but you chose to cross swords with Ramiro del Orca, and you have got your death blow. May God have mercy on your soul." "I am praying," said I, "for just so much mercy as you shall have justice. If my prayer is heard, I should be well content." He changed countenance a little. "So, too, I thought, did Madonna Paula. My firmness may have yielded her some grain of comfort." Ramiro set his hands on his hips and eyed me squarely. "You are a dauntless rogue," he confessed. I laughed for answer, and in that moment it entered my mind that I might yet enjoy some measure of revenge in this life. More than that, I might benefit Madonna. For the seed I was about to sow to take root in the craven heart of Ramiro del Orca, it would so fully occupy his mind that he would have little time to bestow on Paula in the few hours that were left him. But before I could bethink me of words, he was speaking again. "I held out to you a slender hope," said he. "I told you that there was one little thing might save you. That hope has borne no fruit. The little thing, I spoke, it has not come to pass. It rested with Madonna Paula. Here, she had it in her hands to effect your salvation, but she has refused. Your blood rests on her head." She shuddered at the words, and a low moan escaped her. She covered her face with her hands. A moment I stood looking at her. Then I shifted my glance to Ramiro. "Will it please you, illustrious, to allow me a few moments' conversation with Madonna Paula di Santafiore?" I invested my tones with a weight of meaning that did not escape him. His face suddenly lightened, whilst one of his officers, a fellow very fitly named Lapone, laughed outright. "Your hero seems none so heroic after all," he said derisively to the governor. "The imminence of death makes him amenable." Ramiro scowled on him for answer. Then, turning to me, "Do you think you could bend her stubbornness?" quoth he. "I might attempt it," answered I. His eyes flashed with evil hope. His lips parted in a smile. He shot a glance at Madonna, who had withdrawn her hands from her face, and was regarding me now with a strange expression of horror and incredulity, marveling, no doubt, to find me such a craven as I must have seemed. Ramiro looked at the diminishing sunlight on the floor. "In some 5 minutes the sun will have completely set," said he. "Those 5 minutes you shall have to seek to enlist Madonna's aid on your behalf. If you succeed, and she may tell you on what terms you are to have your life, you shall depart from Cesena tonight a free man." He paused a moment, and his eyes, lighted by an odious smile, rested once more on Madonna Paula. Then he bade all withdraw, and went with them into an adjoining chamber, fondly nurturing the hopes that were begotten of his belief that Lazaro Biancamont was a villain. When we were alone, she and I stood a moment where they had left me, my hands pinioned behind me, and the cord which the executioner had held trailing the ground like a lambent tail. Then I went slowly forward until I stood close before her. Her eyes were on my face, still with that same look of unbelief. "Madonna mia," said I, "do not for an instant think that it is my purpose to ask of you any sacrifice that might save my worthless life. Rather was my purpose in seeking these few moments with you, to strengthen and encourage you by such news as it is mine to bring." She looked now as if she scarcely understood. "If I will wed him tonight, he has promised that you shall go free," she said in a whisper. "He says that he can bring a priest from the neighborhood at a moment's notice." "Do not heed him," I cried sternly. "I do not heed him," said she more composedly. "If he seeks to force me, I shall find a way of setting myself free. Dear Mother of Heaven, death were a sweet and restful thing after all that I have suffered in these days." Then she fell suddenly to weeping. "Think me not an utter coward, Lazaro. Willingly would I do this thing to save so noble a life as yours. Did I not think that you must hate me for it? I was stout and firm in my refusal, confident that you had had me so. Was I not right, my poor, poor Lazaro?" "Madonna, you were right," I answered firmly and calmly. "And you are to die, amor mio," she murmured passionately. "You are to die when the promise of happiness seemed held out to us. And yet, were you to live at the price at which life is offered you, would your life be endurable? Tell me the truth. Lazaro, swear it to me. For if life is the dearer thing to you, why then you shall have your life. Need you ask me, Paola? Question I. Does not your heart tell you how much easier is death than would be such life as I must lead hereafter, even if we could trust Ramiro, which we cannot? Be brave, Madonna, and help me be brave and bear thyself with becoming fortitude. Now, listen to what I have to tell you. Ramiro del Orca is a traitor who is plotting the death of his overlord. Proofs of it are by now in the hands of Cesare Borgia. And in some 7 or 8 hours, the Duke himself should be here to put this monster to the question touching these matters. I will say a word in his ear ere I depart that will fill his mind with a very wholesome fear, and you will find that during the few hours left him, he will have little leisure to think of you and afflict you with his odious wooing. Be strong, then, for a little while, for Cesare has come to set you free. She looked at me now with eyes that were wide open. Suddenly, could we not gain time? She cried, and in her eagerness she rose and set her hands upon my shoulders. Could I not pretend to acquiesce to his wishes, and so delay your end? I have thought of it, I answered gloomily, but the thought has brought me no hope. Ramiro is not be trusted. He might tell you that he sets me free, but he dare not do so. He fears that I may have knowledge of his dealings with Vitelli, and assuredly he would break faith with us. Again the coming of the Duke might be delayed. Alas, I ended in despair. There is nothing to be done but to let things run their course. There was even more in my mind than I expressed. My mistrust of Ramiro went further than I had explained, and concerning Madonna more closely than it did me. Nay, Lazaro mine, she still protested. I will attempt it. It is, at least, well worth the risk. You forget, said I, that even when Cesare comes we cannot say how he will bear himself towards you. You would have been betrothed to his cousin, Ignacio. It is a matter upon which he may insist. She looked at me for a moment with anguish in her eyes that turned my misery into torture. Lazaro, she moaned, was ever woman so beset? I think that heaven must have laid some curse upon me. Her face was close to mine. I stooped forward and kissed her on her brow. May God have you in his keeping, Madonna mia. I murmured. The sun is gone. Lazaro, it was a cry of a breaking heart. Her arms went round my neck, and in a passion of grief her kisses burned on my lips. Then the door of the anteroom opened, and I thanked God for the mercy of that interruption. I whispered a word to her, and in obedience she sprang back, and sank limp and broken on the chair once again. Ramiro entered, his men behind him, his face alit with eagerness. There, and then I swamped his hopes. The sun is gone, magnificent, said I. You had best get me hanged. His brow darkened, for there was a note of mockery and triumph in my voice. You have fooled me, animal, he cried. His jaw set, and his eyes continued to regard me with an evil glow. Then he laughed terribly, shrugged his shoulders, and spoke again. After all, it shall avail you little. He turned to the Carnifex. Federigo, do your work, said he, whereupon the fellow stepped behind me, and the halberdiers ranged themselves one on either side of me again. A word ere I go, Messer del Orca, I demanded insolently. He looked at me sharply, wondering, maybe, at the fresh tone I took. Say it, and be gone, he sullenly permitted me. I paused a moment to choose fitting words for that portentous death song of mine. At length, you boasted to me a little while ago, said I, smiling grimly, that the man did not live who had thrice fooled you. That man does live, for that man am I. Bah! He returned contemptuously, thinking, no doubt, that I refer to my interview with Madonna Paola. You may take what pride you will from such a thought. You are upon the threshold of death. True, but the thought is one that affords me more comfort and joy than pride. As much comfort and joy as you shall take horror when I tell you in what manner I have fooled you. I pause to heighten the sensation of my words. To such good purpose have I used my wits that ere another sun shall rise, and set you have followed me along the black road that I am now treading, the road whose bourne is the gallows. Bethink you of the charred paper that last night you brushed from this table, when you awoke to find a candle fallen on the treacherous letter Vitelli sent you in the lining of a hat. His jaw fell. His face flamed redder than ever for a second. Then it went gray as ashes. "Of what do you prate, fool?" he questioned huskily, seeking to bluster before the startled glances of his officers. "I speak," said I, "of that charred paper." It was I who laid the candle across it, but it was a virgin sheet I burned, Vitelli's letter I had first abstracted. "You lie," he almost screamed. "To prove that I do not, I will tell you what it contained. It held proof that, bribed by the tyrant of Città di Castello, you had undertaken to pose an arbalister to slay the Duke on the occasion of his coming visit to Cesena." He glared at me a moment in furious amazement. Then he turned to his officers. "Do not heed him," he bade them. "The dog lies to sow doubts in your minds ere he goes out to hang. It is a puerile revenge." I laughed with amused confidence. There was one among them had heard Lampignani's words touching the messenger's hat, words that had cost a fellow his life. But my concern was little with the effect my words might produce upon his followers. "By tomorrow you will know whether I have lied or not. Nay, before then shall you know it. For by midnight Cesare Borgia should be at Cesena. Vitellozzo Vitelli's letter is in his hands by now." At that Ramiro burst into a laugh. So convinced was he of the impossibility of my having got the letter to the Duke, even if what I had said of its abstraction were true, that he gathered assurance for what seemed to him so monstrous an exaggeration. "By your own words you confounded," said he. "Out of your own mouth have you proven your lies. Assuming that all you say were true, how could you, who since last night have been a prisoner, have got a messenger to bear anything from you to Cesare Borgia?" I looked at him with a contemptuous amusement that daunted him. "Where is Mariani?" I asked quietly. "Where is the father of the lad you so brutally and wantonly slew yesternight? Seek him throughout Cesena, and when you find him not, perhaps you will realize that one who had seen his own son suffer such an outrageous and cruel death at your brigand hands would be a willing and ready instrument in an act that should avenge him. Virgin Santa, what a consternation was his! He must have missed Mariani early in the day, for he took no measure, asked no questions that might confirm or refute the thing I announced. His face grew livid and his knees loosened. He sank onto a chair and mopped the cold sweat from his brow with his great brown hand. No thought had he now for the eyes of his officers or their opinions. Fear, icy and horrid, such fear as in his time he had inspired in 1,000 hearts, was now possessed of his. Sweet indeed was the flavor of my vengeance. His officers instinctively drew away from him before the guilt so clearly written on his face, and their eyes were full of doubt as to how they should proceed, and of some fear, for it must have been passing through their minds that they stood, themselves, in danger of being involved with him in the Duke's punishment of his disloyalty. This was more than had ever entered into my calculations or found room in my hopes. By a brisk appeal to them, it almost seemed that I might work my salvation in this 11th hour. Madonna watched the scene with eyes that suggested to me that the same hope had arisen in her own mind. My halberdiers and the carnifex alone stood stolidly indifferent. Ramiro was to them the man that hired them. With his intriguing they had no concern. For a moment or two there was a silence, and Ramiro sat staring before him, his white face glistening with the sweat of fear. A very coward at heart was this overbearing ogre Cesena, who for years had been the terror and scourge of the countryside. At last he mastered his emotion and sprang to his feet. "You have had the laugh of me," he snarled, fury now ringing in his voice. "But ere you die you may regret it that you mocked me." He turned to the executioner. "Strip him," he commanded fiercely. "He shall not hang as I intended. At least not before we have torn every bone of his body from its socket. To the cord with him." And he pointed to the torture at the end of the hall. The executioner made shift to obey him when suddenly Madonna Paula leapt to her feet, her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright with new excitement. "Is there none here," he cried, appealing to Ramiro's officers, "that will draw his sword in the service of his overlord, the Duke of Valentino? There stands a traitor, and there one who has proven his loyalty to Cesare Borgia. The Duke is likely to demand a heavy price for the life of that faithful one, to whose warning he owes his escape of assassination. Will none of you side now with the right, that anon you may stand well with Cesare Borgia when he comes? Or, by idly allowing this traitor to have his way, will you participate in the punishment that must be his?" It was the very spur they needed, and scarce was that final question of hers flung at those knaves, when the answer came from one of them. It was that same sturdy Lapone. "I, for one, am for the Duke," said he, and his sword leapt from its scabbard. "I draw my iron for Valentino. Let every loyal man do likewise and seize this traitor." And with his sword, he pointed at Ramiro. In an instant, 3 others bared their weapons and ranged themselves beside him. The remaining 2, of whom was Lacagnolo, folded their hands, manifesting by that impassivity that they were minded to take neither one side nor the other. The Carnifex paused in his labors of undressing me, and the affair promised to grow interesting. But Ramiro did not stand his ground. Fury swelling his veins and crimsoning his huge face, he sprang to the door and bellowed to his guards. 6 men trooped in almost at once, and reinforced by the halberdiers that had been guarding me, they made short work of the resistance of those 4 officers. In as little time as it takes me to record it, they were disarmed and ranged against the wall behind those guards and others that had come to their support, to be dealt with by Ramiro after he had dealt with me. His fear of Cesari's coming was put by for the moment in his fierce lust to be avenged upon me who had betrayed him and the officers who had turned against him. Madonna sank back once more in her despair. The little spark that she had so bravely fanned to life had been quenched almost as soon as it had shown itself. "Now, Federigo," said Ramiro grimly, "I am waiting." The executioner resumed his work, and in an instant I stood stripped of my brigandine. As the fellow led me, unresisting, to the torture, for what resistance could have availed me now? I tried to pray for strength to endure what was to come. I was done with life. For some portion of an hour I must go through the cruelest of agonies, and then, when it pleased God in His mercy that I should swoon, it would be to wake no more in this world, for they would bear out my unconscious body and hang it by the neck from that black beam they called Ramiro del Orca's flagstaff. I cast a last glance at Madonna. She had fallen on her knees, and with folded hands was praying intently, none heeding her. Federigo halted me beneath the pulleys, and his horrid hands grew busy adjusting the ropes to my wrists. And then, when the last ray of hope had faded, but before the executioner had completed his hideous task, a trumpet blast, winding a challenge to the gates of the castle of Cecina, suddenly rang out upon the evening air, and startled us all by its sudden and imperious note. Chapter 21. Ave Caesar. For just an instant, I allowed myself to be tortured by the hope that a miracle had happened, and here was Cesare Borgia come a good 8 hours before it was possible for Mariani to have fetched him from Faenza. The same doubt may have crossed Ramiro's mind, for he changed color and sprang to the door to bawl an order forbidding his men to lower the bridge. But he was too late. Before he was answered by his followers, we heard the creaking of the hinges and the rattle of the running chains, ending in a thud that told us the drawbridge had dropped across the moat. Then came the loud, continuous thunder of many hoofs upon its timbers. Paralyzed by fear, Ramiro stood where he had halted, turning his eyes wildly in this direction and in that, but never moving one way or the other. It must be Cesare, I swore to myself. Who else could ride to Cesena with such numbers? But then, if it was Cesare, it could not be that he had seen Mariani, for he could not have ridden from Faenza. Madonna had risen too, and with a white face and straining eyes, she was looking towards the door. And then our doubts were at last ended. There was a jangle of spurs and fall of feet, and through the open door stepped a straight, martial figure in a doublet of deep crimson velvet, trimmed with costly lynx furs and slashed with satin in the sleeves and shoulder puffs. Jewels gleamed in the massive chain across his breast and at the Marroquin girdle that carried his bronze-hilted sword. His hose was of red silk, and his great black boots were armed with golden spurs. But to crown all this very regal splendor was a beautiful, pale, cold face of Cesare Borgia, from out of which 2 black eyes flashed and played like sword points on the company. Behind him surged a press of mercenaries in steel, their weapons naked in their hands, so that no doubt was left of the character of this visit. Collecting himself, and bethinking him that after all, he had best assemble a good countenance, Ramiro advanced respectfully to meet his overlord. But ere he had taken 3 steps, the Duke stayed him. "Stand where you are, traitor," was the imperious command. "I'll trust you no nearer to my person." And to emphasize his words, he raised his gloved left hand, which had been resting on his sword hilt, and in which I now observed that he held a paper. Whether Ramiro recognized it, or whether it was that the mere sight of a paper reminded him of the letter which on my testimony should be in Cesari's keeping, or whether again the word traitor, with which Cesare branded him, drove the iron deeper into his soul, I cannot say, but to this I can testify, that he turned a livid green and stood there before his formidable master in an attitude so stricken as to have aroused pity for any man less a villain than was he. And now Cesari's eye, traveling round, alighted on Madonna Paula, standing back in the shadows to which he had instinctively withdrawn at his coming. At sight of her, he recoiled a pace, deeming, no doubt, that it was an apparition stood before him. Then he looked again, and being a man whose mind was above puerile superstitions, he assured himself that by what miracle the thing was wrought, the figure before him was a living body of Madonna Paula Sforza di Sant'Afier. He swept the velvet cap with its jeweled plume from off his auburn locks and bowed low before her. In God's name, Madonna, how are you come to life again, and how do I find you here of all places? She made no ado about enlightening him. That villain, said she, and her finger pointed straight and firmly at Ramiro, put a sleeping potion in my wine on the last night. He dined with us at Pesaro, and when all thought me dead, he came to the church of San Domenico with his men to carry off my sleeping body. He would have succeeded in his fell design, but that Lazzaro Biancamonte, whom you have stayed in the act of torturing to death, was beforehand and saved me from his clutches for a time. This morning at Cattolica his searching sperry discovered me and brought me hither, where I have been for the past 3 hours, and where, but for your Excellency's timely arrival, I shudder to think of the indignities I might have suffered. I thank you, Madonna, for this clear succinctness, answered Cesare coldly, as was his habit. They say he was a passionate man, and such indeed I do believe him to have been. But even in the hottest frenzy of rage, outwardly he was ever the same, icily cold and tranquil. And this, no doubt, was the thing that made him terrible. Presently, Madonna, he pursued, I shall ask you to tell me how it chanced that, having saved you, Messer Biancamont did not bear you to your brother's house. But first I have business with my governor of Cesena, a score which is rendered, if possible, heavier than it already stood by this thing that you have told me. My lord, cried out Ramiro, finding his tongue at last, Madonna has misinformed you. I know nothing of who administered the sleeping potion. Certainly it was not I. I heard a rumor that her body had been stolen, and— Silence! Cesare commanded sternly. Did I question you, dog? His beautiful, terrible eyes fastened upon Ramiro in a glance that defied the man to answer him. Cowed, like a hound at sight of the whip, Ramiro whimpered into silence. Cesare waved his hand in his direction, half turning to the men-at-arms behind him. Take and disarm him, was his passionless command, and while they were doing his bidding, he turned to me and ordered the executioner beside me to unbind my hands and set me at liberty. I owe you a heavy debt, Messer Biancamont, he said, without any warmth, even now that his voice was laden with a message of gratitude. It shall be discharged. It is thanks to your daring and resource that the Seneschal Mariani was able to bring me this letter, this piece of culminating proof against Ramiro del Orca. It is fortunate for you that Mariani was not put to it to ride to Faenza to find me, or else I am afraid we had not reached Cesena in time to save your life. I met him some leagues this side of Faenza, as I was on my way to Sinigaglia. He turned abruptly to Ramiro. In this letter which Vitellai wrote you, said he, it is suggested that there are others in conspiracy. Tell me now, who are those others? See that you answer me with truth, for I shall compel proofs from you of such accusations as you may make. Ramiro looked at him with eyes rendered dull by agony. He moistened his lips with his tongue, and turning his head towards his men, Wine, he gasped from very force of habit. A cup of wine. Let it be supplied him, said Cesare coldly, and we all stood waiting while a servant filled him a cup. Ramiro gulped the wine avidly, never pausing until the goblet was empty. Now, said Cesare, who had been watching him, will it please you to answer my question? My lord, said Ramiro, revived and strengthened in spirit by the draught, I must ask your excellency to be a little plainer with me. To what conspiracy is it that you refer? I know of none. What is this letter which you say Vitellai wrote me? I take it you refer to the Lord of Città di Castello. But I can recall no letters passing between us. My acquaintance with him is of the slightest. Cesare looked at him a second. Approach, he curtly bade him, and Ramiro came forward, one of the Borgia halberdiers on either side of him, each holding him by an arm. The Duke thrust a letter under his eyes. "Have you never seen that before?" Ramiro looked at it a moment, and his attempt at dissembling bewilderment was a ludicrous thing to witness. "Never," he said brazenly at last. Cesare folded the letter and slipped it into the breast of his doublet. From his girdle, he took a second paper. He turned from Ramiro. "Don Miguel," he called. From behind his men-at-arms, a tall man, all dressed in black, stood forward. It was a sorry Spanish captain, one whose name was as well known and as well dreaded in Italy as Cesari's own. The Duke held out to him the paper that he had produced. "You heard the question that I asked Messer del Orca?" he inquired. "I heard, illustrious," answered Miguel with a bow. "See that you obtain me an answer to it, as well as an account of the other matters that I have noted on this list, concerning the misappropriation of stores, the retention of taxes illicitly levied, and the wanton cruelty towards my good citizens of Cesena. Put him to the question without delay, and record me his replies. The implements are yonder." And with the same calm indifference which characterizes every word and action, Cesare pointed to the torture and turned to Madonna Paula, as though he gave the matter of Ramiro del Orca and his misdeeds not another thought. "Mercy, my lord," rang now the voice of Ramiro, laden with horrid fear. "I will speak." "Then do so to Don Miguel. He will question you in my name." Again he turned to Madonna. "Madonna Paula, may I conduct you hence? Things may perhaps occur which it is not seemly your gentle eyes should witness. Messer Biancamont, attend us." Now, in spite of all that Ramiro had made me suffer, I should have been loath to have remained and witnessed his examination. That they would torture him was now inevitable. His chance of answering freely was gone. Even if he returned meek replies to Don Miguel's questions, that gentleman would, no doubt, still submit him to the cord by way of assuring himself that such replies were true ones. Gladly, then, did I turn to follow the Duke and Madonna Paula into the adjoining chamber, to which Cesare led the way, even as Don Miguel's voice was raised to command his men to clear the hall, to the end that he might conduct his examination in private. The three of us stood in the anteroom. A servant had lighted the tapers and closed the doors, and the Duke turned to me, first Messer Biancamont, to discharge my debt. "You are, if I am not misinformed, the lord by right of birth of certain lands that bear your name, which suffered sequestration during the reign of the late Costanzo, tyrant of Pesaro, whose son Giovanni upheld that confiscation. Am I right?" "Your Excellency is very well informed. The lord of Pesaro did make me tardy restitution. So tardy, indeed, that the lands which he restored to me had already virtually passed from his possession." Cesare smiled. "In recompense of the service you have rendered me this day," said he, and my heart thrilled at the words and at the thought of the joy which I was about to bear to my old mother, "I reinvest you in your lands of Biancamont for so long as you are content to recognize in me your overlord, and to be loyal, true, and faithful to my rule." I bowed, murmuring something of the joy I felt and the devotion I should entertain. "Then, that is done with. You shall have the deed from my hand by morning. And now, Madonna, will you grant me some explanation of your conduct in leaving Pesaro in this man's company, instead of repairing to your brother's house, when you awakened from the effects of the potion Ramiro gave you, or must I seek the explanation from Messer Biancamont?" Her eyes fell before the scrutiny of his, and when they were raised again it was to meet my glance, and if Cesare could not for himself read the message of those eyes, why then his penetration was by no means what the world accounted it. "My lord," I cried, "let me explain. I love Madonna Paula. It was love of her that led me to the church and kept me there that night. It was love of her and the overmastering passion of my grief at her so sudden death that led me, in a madness, to desire once more to look upon her face ere they delivered it to earth's keeping. Thus was it that I came to discover that she lived. Thus was it that I anticipated Ramiro del Orca. He came upon us almost before I had raised her from the coffin. Yet love lent me strength and craft to delude him. We had a while in the sacristy, and it was there, after Madonna had revived, that the pent-up passion of years burst the bond with which reason had bidden me restrain it. "By the host," cried Cesare, his brows drawn down in a frown, "you are a bold man to tell me this. And you, Madonna," he cried, turning suddenly to her, "what have you to say?" "Only, my lord, that I have suffered more, I think, in these past few days than has ever fallen to the lifetime share of another woman. I think, my lord, that I have suffered enough to have earned me a little peace and a little happiness for the remainder of my days. All my life have men plagued me with marriages that were hateful to me, and this has culminated in the brutal act of Ramiro del Orca. Do you not think that I have endured enough?" He stared at her for a moment. "Then you love this fellow," he gasped. "You, Madonna Paula Sforza di Sant'Afier, one of the noblest ladies in all Italy, confess to love this lordling of a few barren acres? I loved him, illustrious, when he was much less than that. I loved him when he was little better than the fool of the court of Pesaro, and not even the shame of the motley that disgraced him could stay the impulse of my affections." He laughed curiously. "By my faith," said he, "I have gone through life complaining of the want of frankness in the men and women I have met. But you too seem to deal in it liberally enough to satisfy the most ardent seeker after truth. I would that Pontius Pilate could have known you." Then he grew sterner. "But what account of this evening's adventure am I to bear to my cousin Ignacio?" She hung her head in silence, whilst my own spirit trembled. Then suddenly I spoke. "My lord," said I, "if you take her back to Pesaro, you may keep the deed of Biancamont. For unless Madonna Paula goes thither with me, your gift is a barren one, your reward of no account or value to me." "I would not have it so," said he, his head on one side and his fingers toying with his auburn beard. "You saved my life, and you must be rewarded fittingly. Then, illustrious, in payment for my preservation of your life, do you render happy mine, and we shall thus be quits." "My lord," cried Paula, putting forth her hands in supplication, "if you have ever loved, befriend us now." A shadow darkened his face for an instant, then it was gone, and his expression was as inscrutable as ever. Yet he took her hands in his and looked down into her eyes. "They say that I am hard, bloodthirsty, and unfeeling," he said in tones that were almost a complaint. "But I am not proof against so much appeal. Ignacio must find him a bride in Spain, and if he is wise and would taste the sweets of life, he will see to it that he finds him a willing one. As for you two, Cesare Borgia shalt stand your friend. He owes you no less. I will be godfather to your nuptials. Thus shall the blame and consequences rest on me. Paula Sforza di Sant'Afier is dead, men think. We will leave them thinking it. Filippo must know the truth, but you can trust me to make your brother take a reasonable view of what has come to pass. After all, there may be a disparity in your ranks, but it is purely adventitious, for noble though you may be, Madonna Paula, you are wedding one who seems no less noble of heart, whatever the parts he may have played in life." He smiled inscrutably as he added, "I have in mind that you once sought service with me, Messer Biancamont, and if a martial life allures you still, I'll make you lord of something better far than Biancamont." I thanked him, and Madonna joined me in that expression of gratitude, an expression that fell very short of all that was in our hearts. But touching that offer of his that I should follow his fortunes, I beg him not to insist. The possession of Biancamont has from my cradle been the goal of all my hopes. It is patrimony enough for me, and there, with Madonna Paula, I'll take a long farewell of ambition, which is but the seed of discontent. "Why, as you will," he sighed. And then, before more could be said, there came from the adjoining room a piercing scream. Cesare raised his head, and his lips parted in the faintest vestige of a smile. "They are exacting the truth from the governor of Cesena," said he. "I think, Madonna, that we had better move a little farther off. Ramiro's voice makes indifferent music for a lady's ear." She was white as death at the horrid noise and all the things of which it may have reminded her, and so we passed from the antechamber and sought the more distant places of the castle. Here let me pause. We were married on the morrow, which was Christmas Eve, and in the gray dawn of the Christmas morning, we set out for Biancamont with the escort which Cesare Borgia placed at our disposal. As we rode out from the citadel of Cesena, we saw the last of Ramiro del Orca. Beyond the gates, in the center of the public square, a block stood planted in the snow. On the side nearer the castle, there was a dark mass over which a rich mantle had been thrown. It was of purple color, and in the uncertain light, it was not easy to tell where the cloak ended and the stain that embroidered the snow began. On the other side of the block, a decapitated head stood mounted on an upright pike, and the sightless eyes of Ramiro del Orca looked from his grinning face upon the town of Cecina, which he had so wantonly misruled. Madonna shuddered and turned her head aside as we rode past that dread emblem of the Borgia justice. To efface from her mind the memory of such a thing on such a day, I talked to her, as we cantered out into the country, of the life to come, of the mother that waited to welcome us, and of the glad tidings with which we were to rejoice her on that Christmas day. There is no moral to my story. I may not end with one of those graceful admonitions beloved of Messer Boccacci, to whom in my jester's days I owed so much. Not mine is it to say with him, wherefore, gentle ladies, or noble sirs, beware of this, avoid that other thing. Mine is a plain tale, written in the belief that some account of those old happenings that befell me may offer you some measure of entertainment, and written, too, in the support of certain truths which my contemporaries have been shamefully inclined and simoniacally induced to suppress. Many chroniclers set forth how the Lord Vitellozzo Vitelli and his associates were barbarously strangled by Cesari's orders at Sinigaglia, and willfully, for I cannot believe that it results from ignorance, are they silent touching the reason, leaving you to imagine that it was done in obedience to a ruthlessness of character beyond parallel, so that you may come to consider Cesare Borgia as black, as they were paid to paint him. To confute them do I set down these facts of which my knowledge cannot be called in question, and also that you may know the true story of Paola di Santafiore, and more particularly that part of it which lies beyond the death she did not die. The sun of that Christmas day was setting, as we drew near to Biancamont and the humble dwelling of my old mother. We fell into talk of her once more. Suddenly Paola turned in her saddle to confront me. "Tell me, Lord of Biancamont, will she love me a little, think you?" she asked to plague me. "Who would not love you, Lady of Biancamont?" counter-questioned I.